What if the greatest royal secrets were never locked in towers, but hidden in plain sight, stitched into corsets, buried under powdered wigs, and whispered through centuries of polished scandal? This isn't the monarchy you learned in school. This is 53 tales of horse teeth, exploding coffins, and kings who mistook diplomacy for dating apps. They ruled with jewels, but lived with chaos. And somehow, it's all true. Welcome to the strange, scandalous, and slightly unhinged world of England's most bizarre royal moments. Crowns on, gloves off. Let's begin. Before we dive headfirst into powdered scandals and royal mishaps, make sure you're subscribed, because yes, it gets weirder. And while you're here, drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from, and what time is it right now? Midnight in Manchester? 3 a.m. in Ohio? We're building a global court of night owls, and your place at the table is waiting. 1. King James I's box of horse teeth. In the great vault of monarchic oddities, some artifacts shine brighter than royal jewels. And then there's the small wooden box under King James I's bed. Not gilded, not jeweled, just filled with horse teeth. Yes, really, horse teeth. While other kings might stash letters from mistresses or coded war plans in such a private place, James preferred something more equine. He believed these molars, yanked from the mouths of royal steeds long since turned to glue, brought good luck. A superstition he apparently clung to as tightly as a child with a blanket. And no one knows how many teeth were in the box. We can only assume too many. James, the same monarch who authorized the King James Bible, also authored a furious little treatise against witches, Daemonology. He hated tobacco with a zeal that could rival a modern wellness blogger. He feared assassination so deeply that he refused to sleep in rooms with windows too close to the ground. But amidst all this fire and brimstone paranoia, he cradled his oddest security blanket close, that box of teeth. You might be wondering, why horse teeth? The answer is frustratingly elusive. Maybe they reminded him of lost cavalry victories. Or maybe he just liked horses. Or maybe, as some whispered behind palace walls, the king had a thing. A belief that the power of the animal, strength, loyalty, nobility, could somehow rub off through proximity. Or maybe it was just one of those habits kings develop when nobody around them ever says, "Hey, maybe let's not keep decaying animal parts under the mattress." Imagine the servant who had to dust the box, or worse, open it. But that's the nature of royal eccentricity. Dressed up in divine rite, even the utterly deranged becomes tradition. No one questioned the box, no one removed it, and when James died, it quietly disappeared from the historical record. No burial with honors, no museum display, just gone, like a weird little footnote in the royal psyche. What's most curious isn't the superstition. People have done stranger things to feel safe. It's that this man, entrusted with the fate of an empire, feared witches, tobacco, and the night air, but found comfort in the jaws of beasts. Maybe that's the paradox of power. The more you have, the more fragile you feel. And that particular fragility, it turns out, had 32 teeth. Which brings us to another monarch who never quite learned how to let go, not of horses, but of her clothes. 2. Elizabeth I's 2,000 dresses and zero laundry. Elizabeth I ruled England for 45 years. She crushed the Spanish Armada, outfoxed Parliament, and cultivated a mythic persona so divine that even her wrinkles were considered regal. But when it came to hygiene, Her Majesty fell short, very short. The Virgin Queen, brilliant, commanding, and feared, was also, in all likelihood, a bit ripe. She famously owned more than 2,000 gowns, extravagant, hand-stitched, gem-encrusted dresses in a rainbow of Elizabethan excess, some stitched with silver thread, some with embroidered phoenixes, others with hidden messages and pearls. And yet, she was notoriously stingy about laundry. Royal rumour has it she sometimes wore the same dress for months without washing it. Let that sink in. Months. Even by 16th century standards, when soap was luxury and water was suspect, Elizabeth's wardrobe habits stood out. Servants begged to replace her garments. Tailors feared being summoned to repair what had essentially become royal compost. But Elizabeth was unmoved. She had the spine of a monarch and the cleanliness of a hermit crab. Why the reluctance? Some say it was her obsession with appearance. She believed overwashing would damage the delicate silks. Others whisper it was fear, that disrobing too often made her vulnerable. There's also the possibility that with so many enemies, she trusted only herself with her clothing. Or maybe, just maybe, she liked the smell of power, and everyone else just had to endure it. Her face, caked in white lead makeup and egg-white glaze, created a porcelain mask, her hands gloved in perfumed oils. But under the lace and velvet, a royal stew. By the end of her reign, Elizabeth was more image than person, her regalia an armour, her wardrobe a fortress that had never been laundered. This paradox of opulence and decay defines much of her court. It was dazzling, distant, and just a little bit mouldy. Foreign ambassadors praised her wit and feared her fury. Courtiers wrote poems about her beauty, while probably standing upwind. But here's the truth buried beneath the lace. Elizabeth's power wasn't clean. It was layered, masked, preserved through myth, not hygiene. Her majesty existed in the performance, not in the laundering. Which brings us to her royal ancestor, a man who took his obsession with meat and machinery to even stranger places. Where Elizabeth avoided soap, he avoided manual labor by enslaving dogs to roast his dinner. If you're still here after royal spit roasting and tree whispering, you might be one of us. The curious, the sleep-deprived, the royally entertained. So go ahead and subscribe for more strange history served with a crown and a smirk. And while you're at it, tell me, where are you watching from and what time is it right now? Is this your bedtime story or your morning chaos scroll? Either way, you're in good company. 3. Henry VIII's meat-spinning dog wheel. Let's set the table. Picture a Tudor feast. Dripping joints of meat, roasted swans, refeathered for drama, pies stuffed with larks. And in the centre of it all, not just gluttony, but innovation. Because Henry VIII, ever the patron of indulgence, had a problem. Meat took time. Roasting required constant turning on a spit, a peasant's job. So naturally, he invented a solution, or rather had one invented. Enter the turnspit dog. A special breed of short, muscular dog trained to run inside a giant hamster wheel, one attached to a mechanical spit. The dog ran, the wheel turned, the meat cooked, and Henry ate. Efficient? Yes. Humane? Not even close. These dogs lived under the kitchen hearth, emerging only to run their hot, smoky marathons while entire pigs rotated before them. When one dog tired, another took its place. It was culinary automation, centuries before the assembly line, except powered by creatures bred for endurance and exploited for convenience. And the king? He loved it, because nothing says divine right like eating roast beef that's been evenly turned by a sweating dog. It said Henry would walk past the kitchens and chuckle at the sight, not out of cruelty, at least not overtly, but because it represented progress, a symbol of Tudor modernity. Why employ a peasant when you can breed a machine? There's even evidence that these dogs were given names, not out of affection, but inventory. You didn't pet them, you replaced them. One 16th century cook's manual refers to them as common turnspits, as if they were just another utensil. By the time the Industrial Revolution rolled around, these dogs were mostly phased out, but for a brief, greasy moment in history, Henry VIII turned his appetite into policy and dogs into gears. It's easy to laugh now, until you remember this was the same man who changed the entire religious structure of England just to swap wives, a man who saw loyalty as transactional and innovation as edible. But here's the twist. His mechanical marvel wasn't about meat, it was about control. Even dinner, down to the spinning of a lamb shank, had to revolve around his will. And speaking of things pulverized for royal benefit, let's talk about Charles II and his obsession with powdered skulls. 4. Charles II and the medicine made of skulls. In a world where kings claimed divine blood, Charles II preferred his medicine infused with someone else's. Literal skulls. The merry monarch, known for reopening theatres, fathering a dozen illegitimate children, and dodging Puritan gloom with an almost athletic grace, had a deeply curious side. He dabbled in chemistry, supported the Royal Society, and maintained his own private laboratory, a smoky chamber of curiosities at Whitehall Palace, where he fancied himself a scientist. Not just a monarch, but a man of natural philosophy, as it was called before science got its branding right. But Charles's idea of medicine, that's where things start to calcify. One of his favourite concoctions involved something called human skull powder, a fine dust made from ground cranial bones. It was part of a broader, genuinely popular belief in mummy medicine, where ancient remains were treated not with reverence, but as over-the-counter remedies. Crushed skulls, dried blood, even bits of human fat, all considered potent cures for everything from epilepsy to melancholy. But Charles didn't just endorse this trend. He reportedly kept his own supply. Some accounts claim he helped prepare it himself, wearing a velvet robe while swirling bone dust into wine like a macabre mixologist. It was said to be best taken during seizures, which Charles himself never suffered from. But apparently being king meant sampling treatments just in case. Call it preventative medicine by way of grave robbery. The irony: Charles was an absolute skeptic when it came to religion. He spent his reign dancing between Anglican loyalty and secret Catholic sympathies, not out of piety, but political necessity. Yet here he was, embracing medical theories that owed more to alchemy and medieval mysticism than modern logic. The king who reopened the playhouses also believed ground-up skulls could prolong his life. This wasn't fringe behavior. Members of court followed his lead. Apothecaries stocked it. Physicians prescribed it. Royal favor had a way of turning taboos into trends. So if the king stirred powdered death into his morning tonic, well, you didn't question it. You just smiled, nodded, and asked if he wanted it sweetened. Charles died in 1685, aged 54, after a sudden stroke. His doctors tried every possible remedy to revive him, including bleeding him of nearly a pint of blood, blistering his skin, and, yes, administering more of that delightful skull-based potion. Spoiler, it didn't work. In the end, all the powdered wisdom of the dead couldn't save a king who spent his life dancing at the edge of decadence and curiosity. But at least he died as he lived, surrounded by strange remedies, questionable science, and a court too polite to ask, "Are we sure this works?" Which brings us, oddly, to another royal who spoke more freely, not to people, but to trees. 5. George III and the royal family tree, literally. There's eccentric, there's misunderstood, and then there's George III, the monarch who ruled during the American Revolution and occasionally had long, heartfelt conversations with oaks, not metaphorically, literally. The king who lost the colonies also lost, for periods of his life, his grip on reality. But before we flatten him into the pop history label of the Mad King, consider this. He was one of the most diligent rulers Britain ever had. He read every bill, annotated every policy, and took his position with a sense of moral seriousness that many before and after him completely lacked, which makes it all the more jarring that during certain episodes he believed trees were his relatives. Windsor Park was his sanctuary. There, in the company of chirping birds and rustling leaves, George would walk for hours, talking aloud to the branches. Not in a vague philosophical way. He named them, he greeted them, he asked after their health, he thanked them for their loyalty. In some accounts, he even apologized to them. For what, no one was quite sure. This behavior, depending on whom you asked, was either the product of untreated porphyria, a disease later debated, or undiagnosed mental illness. But in the 18th century, medicine wasn't exactly delicate. Treatment options included isolation, bleeding, and purging. Not surprisingly, none of it worked. And so, while Parliament fretted and newspapers speculated, George took solace in his arboreal counsel. Imagine the scene: a king in a powdered wig and waistcoat, bowing to a sycamore and calling it cousin. To the public, this was cause for mockery. Political cartoons showed him covered in leaves, muttering nonsense, while ministers behind him panicked about foreign policy. To his family, it was heartbreaking. His son, the future George IV, waited in the wings for decades, as his father veered between lucidity and leaf whispering. But here's the twist: George III wasn't stupid, far from it. He was well-read, multilingual, morally upright, and deeply committed to constitutional monarchy. He just unraveled, slowly, publicly, painfully. And perhaps that's the tragedy of it all. His conversations with trees weren't madness, they were memory. A desperate attempt to ground himself, literally, in a world where his decisions were judged by wars he couldn't win and a family he couldn't trust. If trees were kinder than courtiers, can we really blame him? So while history laughs at George the Tree Whisperer, maybe we've misunderstood him all along. Maybe the trees were the only ones listening, which makes Queen Victoria's obsession with her own body feel oddly familiar, if a little more self-centered. 6. Victoria's post-dinner weigh-ins. Imagine ruling over 1/5 of the world's population and still needing to know, down to the ounce, how much you weigh after dinner. Enter Queen Victoria, Empress of India, icon of grief and covert scale enthusiast. While she's often remembered as the severe widow draped in eternal black, Victoria was far from humorless. She adored opera, loved her dogs like children, and wrote journals that dripped with sarcasm and sass. But she was also, beneath the veils and imperial bluster, deeply preoccupied with her physical form. Not just how she appeared in public, but how much she weighed, particularly after meals. It became routine. Dinner concluded, servants cleared the table, and then came the ritual. Out came the scale. A custom-made apparatus, no ordinary bathroom contraption, sturdy, discreet, and handled only by her trusted physician. He would note her postprandial pounds in a little log, presumably next to her pulse, and complaints of court gossip. Why? No one's exactly sure. Victoria never dieted. She didn't exercise. She famously declared, "I don't like babies who are thin. I like fat ones." She enjoyed hearty meals and favored rich sauces. And yet, the numbers mattered. Some say it was her way of measuring self-discipline. Others believe it was sheer curiosity, a scientific mind intrigued by the fluctuations of flesh. Still others suggest it was a private rebellion. In a world where everyone judged her for wearing black, staying indoors, or outliving her prime ministers, at least the scale gave her an answer no one could argue with. The irony, of course, is that Victoria never needed permission to be large. She was royalty. She redefined the image of monarchy through her mourning, her motherhood, and her sheer longevity. But perhaps that's exactly why the scale mattered. When the world stops telling you no, you start inventing your own constraints. There's something almost touching about it. A queen, weary of flattery and political maneuvering, turning to a piece of cold metal for honesty. You can't flatter a scale. You can't charm it. You can only stand there and face the number. And she did, over and over again, as if confirming that yes, she still existed beneath the weight of empire, grief, and crown. Of course, not all monarchs were so self-reflective. Some just wanted bigger chairs, like her son's predecessor, who redefined dining comfort on a royal scale. 7. Edward VII's extra-wide dining chair. There are those who dine, And then there was Edward VII, who dined royally. Before he became king, Bertie, as his family called him, spent most of his life waiting, half a century in his mother Queen Victoria's shadow. And when you're born into royalty but left with nothing to rule, you learn to govern something else entirely, your appetites. Edward governed food. In fact, he reigned over it. 7-course meals were the norm, not the exception. Oysters, consommé, sole poached in champagne, roast duck, saddle of lamb, quail with truffles, and a revolving cast of puddings, all par for a single sitting. His dinners were less about nutrition and more about narrative. The man didn't just eat, he performed consumption, which brings us to the chair. Somewhere between a craving for foie gras and the physical toll of decades-long indulgence, Edward commissioned a custom dining chair, not just for aesthetics, but for logistics. This seat, specially constructed with a widened base, cushioned arms, and reinforced joints, allowed him to enjoy his lavish spreads without the discomfort of being, well, confined by furniture. Call it royal ergonomics. It travelled with him, this chair, to various palaces, grand hotels, and diplomatic events. In Paris, chefs crafted whole menus with him in mind. In London, tailors let out his waistcoats and furniture makers widened his thrones. But this particular chair, intimate, portable, indulgent, was a throne of a different kind, a private stage for a public appetite. To his credit, Edward didn't hide his hedonism. He leaned into it. He was the first modern royal celebrity, photographed in fine restaurants, puffing cigars, surrounded by actresses, mistresses, and fellow gourmands. His appetite became legend, his girth a sort of brand. And the chair? A quiet witness to all of it. Some might call it gluttony, others might call it existential rebellion. A man denied power for decades, claiming dominion over the one thing he could truly control, his pleasure. But here's the irony. Despite the indulgence, Edward was surprisingly effective once he finally ascended the throne. His diplomatic efforts soothed tensions with France. He helped modernize the monarchy. For a man mocked as frivolous, he ruled with surprising grace, wide chair and all. In the end, perhaps the chair wasn't about comfort at all. Maybe it was a monument to survival, to patience, to the idea that sometimes history is shaped not by wars or laws, but by the simple, stubborn act of taking up space. And if you thought Edward's chair was excessive, wait until you meet a king who thought laughter itself was a sin. 8. Henry VI's ban on laughter. Some monarchs inspire admiration, others terror. But Henry VI, he inspired silence, not awe, not reverence, just a deeply uncomfortable quiet. Henry ascended the throne as an infant and ruled for nearly 4 decades, or rather was ruled through for most of it. Passive, pious, and perpetually fragile, he stood out in an era of bloodthirsty ambition. His enemies waged wars. His allies plotted schemes. Henry, meanwhile, tried to pray the noise away. And the laughing? Absolutely not. Henry VI, perhaps in an effort to maintain courtly decorum, or perhaps because joy felt like a threat to his ever-tenuous grip on order, instituted one of the oddest royal decrees in history. No one was allowed to laugh in his presence. Let that sit for a moment. No jokes, no chuckles, no court jesters hamming it up. Even a snort from a noble could be seen as irreverence, possibly even sin. The court became a place of hushed voices, somber glances, and carefully measured expressions. It was less Versailles, more funeral parlour. This wasn't a man allergic to humour. It was deeper. Henry believed laughter was worldly, indulgent, possibly even immoral. He viewed his reign not as a political project, but a spiritual test. A king not of action, but of asceticism. He was often seen dressed in plain clothes. He disliked feasting. He funded colleges and chapels with fervent devotion, as if he could atone for England's bloodshed by sheer piety. His model king? Probably Christ. His model court? A monastery, which would be noble if not for the fact that the world around him was falling apart. The 100 Years' War was collapsing into chaos. The Wars of the Roses were about to begin. Noble families armed themselves, queens schemed, soldiers marched, and through it all, Henry VI sat quietly, unwilling to laugh, unwilling to fight, unwilling, many whispered, to rule. His ban on laughter wasn't just a quirk, it was a symptom of a man wholly unprepared for kingship, of a monarchy so fragile that even joy felt destabilizing, and so silence ruled where strength should have. The irony? His death sparked even more chaos. His legacy wasn't peace, but power vacuums. The laughter returned, not kindly, but cruelly. History has never been gentle with Henry VI. He's remembered as weak, meek, and tragically out of place. Still, in that echo of laughter he forbade, we hear something haunting, a monarch trying desperately to impose order not on the world, but on himself. Which brings us to a queen who did the opposite, declaring her divinity from horseback in a costume straight from myth. 9. Anne of Denmark rides as a Roman goddess. There are royal entrances, and then there's this. A new queen, foreign-born and newly crowned, makes her ceremonial debut into the hearts and minds of England. Anne of Denmark, wife of King James I, had options. She could have chosen dignity, simplicity, elegance. Instead, she chose theatrical divinity. Anne arrived for her coronation dressed not in royal regalia but as Pallas Athena, the Roman goddess of wisdom, strategy, and war. She rode on horseback through the London streets in full costume, helmet, spear, flowing robes, and all. This wasn't just pageantry. This was myth-making on wheels, or more precisely, on hooves. And Londoners were divided. Some cheered, others gasped, many whispered. Was it blasphemy? Was it genius? Had the new queen misunderstood the assignment, or elevated it to a whole new realm of iconography? Anne, for her part, was unfazed. She loved court masks, elaborate costume dramas, and classical symbolism. In her mind, this was branding. A queen who wasn't just consort to a king, but a divine presence unto herself. Athena wasn't just a goddess, she was the goddess of strategic power, and Anne knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't English. She wasn't especially popular. She wasn't even technically Protestant when she arrived, a small political problem swiftly ignored. But she had flair, she had ambition, and she understood that, in a world run by men and myths, the only way to be seen was to become a symbol. Critics scoffed, of course. Satirists painted her as overreaching. Courtiers muttered about her foreign sensibilities. But Anne doubled down. Her court became a hub of the arts, poetry, design, performance. She curated her image like a modern influencer. Every feather, every jewel, every metaphor was deliberate. This wasn't a queen who stood silently beside her husband. This was a queen who galloped into history wearing a helmet. What's more, she did it without a whisper of apology. Anne knew how to control a narrative. She knew how to stage an entrance, and most importantly, she knew how to live inside a legend. So while some queens whispered behind closed doors and others obsessed over their wardrobes, Anne of Denmark became her own mythology, spear and all. And speaking of style obsessions, our next monarch took vanity to a new level, with enough padding to fill an entire costume department. 10. George IV's slimming illusion. Some kings wore crowns. George IV wore illusions. Long before airbrushing, contouring, or Instagram filters, George understood one universal truth. The camera, or in his case, the painted portrait, always lies. And he was determined to be the most flattering lie of all. Born into privilege and anxiety, George was never quite at peace with his appearance. He loved fashion, he loved food, and he loved being adored, and these three traits were constantly at war with one another. His solution? Invent a new kind of truth, one stitched from fabric and fantasy. To the outside world, George was a picture of regality, statuesque, composed, elegant. But behind the wardrobe doors was an entire apparatus of deception. His tailors were instructed to design elaborate clothing, padded, cinched, and sculpted to reshape his expanding frame. Waistcoats were cut high and tight, with panels sewn to hide his belly. Trousers had optical tricks, making his legs appear longer. Jackets included internal corsetry to give the illusion of a more heroic silhouette. He was, quite literally, a walking costume. This wasn't vanity in the simple sense, it was strategy. George lived in an era when royalty had to be more than powerful. They had to be beautiful. The public didn't just want leadership, they wanted spectacle. And George, theatrical to his bones, gave them exactly that. But beneath the brocade was a man who couldn't stop eating, couldn't stop borrowing, and couldn't stop fearing that the real George, the tired, overweight, debt-ridden one, would slip through the seams. His private letters reveal a man constantly fretting over his image, pleading with artists to correct his features, asking tailors for last-minute adjustments, and even refusing public appearances until his clothes made him kingly enough. He wasn't the only royal obsessed with appearances. Far from it. But George's commitment to illusion was unmatched. He didn't just hide behind his clothes, he performed through them. His wardrobe wasn't armor, it was theatre. And he wore the role until the curtain finally closed. In the end, George IV wasn't remembered for great battles or wise decrees. He was remembered for style, for decadence, for looking the part, even if he never quite fit it. Which leads us to a man who rejected image entirely and believed that holiness meant silence, and that laughter, yes, laughter, was the root of all evil. 11. Elizabeth I's lead and vinegar mask. Elizabeth I didn't age, or at least that's what she wanted you to believe. By the time she reached her 40s, the Queen had already become a symbol, not just of power or independence, but of timelessness. The Virgin Queen, the immortal Gloriana, supreme, untouched, and ideally unwrinkled. The problem? Time has no royalist sympathies. Her solution? A beauty regime so extreme it would horrify even the most ambitious skincare influencer. At its core, a facial mask made of vinegar and white lead. White lead, the mixture, known as Venetian ceruse, was all the rage among the noble elite. It promised a perfect porcelain complexion. Pale skin was, after all, the beauty ideal, a mark of nobility, free from the sunburn of labourers. And Elizabeth, surrounded by the pressures of court and portraiture, leaned hard into the trend. Daily. The mask was a paste, applied generously to the face and neck, sometimes even the hands. It created a smooth, ghostly surface. No blemishes, no lines, no reality. Under candlelight, it shimmered like polished marble. Under scrutiny, it cracked, literally. The lead dried out the skin, flaking over time. To fix it, more layers were applied. Rinse, repeat, or rather don't rinse at all. Over years, the effects built up. The Queen's skin suffered, her hair thinned, her teeth darkened, but her myth gleamed because Elizabeth knew the game. In a court full of spies and schemers, appearance was politics. Every image painted of her was a weapon in psychological warfare, showing not just youth, but divinity. Her face was a canvas of power, a mask not just of beauty, but authority. Behind closed doors, she was more vulnerable. She kept mirrors covered. She reportedly banned servants from commenting on her appearance. She demanded portraits that flattered. Even in old age, with eyesight failing and health declining, she clung to the illusion. The mask became not just routine, but ritual. Some historians suggest she believed in the treatment's efficacy. Others think she knew exactly what it was. Poison for the body, but a tonic for control. Either way, the symbolism lingers. A monarch willing to damage herself to project invulnerability. A woman trapped in a role so rigid she had to coat her skin with metal just to play it. But she wasn't alone in chasing dangerous beauty. One of her successors would do it in higher heels, taller wigs, and with just as much theatrical bravado. 12. Charles II's height illusion. Charles II wasn't short, but he wanted to be taller. It's a strange paradox for a king who towered in personality, wit, and, frankly, libido. Yet even Charles, the Restoration's swaggering libertine, felt the pressure to loom. So he turned to fashion, specifically high heels and towering wigs. Charles was returning to a broken kingdom after years of Puritan rule, a land that had executed his father and abolished the monarchy. His mission wasn't just political, it was theatrical. The monarchy had to feel majestic again, and Charles knew that spectacle was half the battle. Thus began the visual rebranding. Heels, already popular in France, became a core part of his image. Not practical boots, but elaborately carved, red-soled, velvet-covered footwear, designed to elevate both height and status. Some were nearly 3 inches high, which combined with Charles's already above-average frame made him a literal standout at court. Next came the wigs, not modest curls, structures, stacks of powdered hair, sometimes reaching half a foot tall, decorated with ribbons, powder, and, on occasion, perfume. The effect? Charles entered a room not just as a man, but as an event. It wasn't just vanity, it was diplomacy. Every appearance at court, every portrait, every royal procession was a performance designed to say, the king is back, and he's larger than life. But the look came at a cost. The wigs were heavy, hot, and required an entire industry of hairdressers and wig makers. The heels were unstable, more suited for a fashion runway than the uneven floors of Restoration palaces. Yet Charles bore the burden, striding into history as a king who ruled not just with charm and compromise, but with couture. His court followed suit. Soon, nobles competed for height and flamboyance. Wig wars broke out, heel height became a subtle form of political ranking, and Charles, ever the ringmaster, smiled from the top of his padded throne. Of course, all this grandiosity was also a shield, a distraction from the political tensions, the debt crises, the religious divisions simmering beneath the surface. The taller the hair, the less you saw of the cracks. But Charles understood something few monarchs ever do. Sometimes power isn't about being taller. It's about looking taller, long enough for people to forget to measure. And speaking of vanity and ornamentation, our next queen stitched her fears right into her embroidery. Skulls, omens, and a little bit of mourning hidden in plain sight. 13. Queen Mary I's embroidered skulls. They called her Bloody Mary, but they rarely mentioned she was also very into needlework. Yes, Queen Mary I of England, the first woman to rule England in her own right, the devout Catholic who burned Protestants and made England's religious tensions even more combustible, was also a prolific embroiderer. Not a hobbyist, not an idle dabbler, a queen with thread and purpose. Her favourite subjects, skulls, thorns, and ominous floral motifs. Gothic, precise, and unsettling. Imagine this. While courtiers debated foreign alliances and religious conversions, Mary sat in a high-backed chair, stitching tiny, meticulous images of death into her handkerchiefs and wall hangings, not the cheery rose garlands or courtly crests you'd expect from royal embroidery. These were meditations on mortality, symbols of suffering, warning, and penance. Memento mori in silk thread. It wasn't entirely unexpected. Mary lived in constant proximity to loss. Her mother, Catherine of Aragon, was cast aside. Her beloved Catholicism was suppressed by her father, Henry VIII. Her claim to the throne was nearly erased. Her health was poor, her reign short. Even her marriage to Philip of Spain, a cold, calculated union of state, failed to give her the child she so desperately wanted. So she stitched. There's something striking about that image. A queen who ruled with fire and iron, also threading black silk through linen. Not to pass time, but to communicate. Her embroidery was a form of internal politics, a place where she could say what speeches and proclamations couldn't. Some of her pieces survive, others were described by startled courtiers. One in particular, a handkerchief with a skull crowned with thorns and surrounded by fading flowers, became a quiet obsession in court gossip. Was it a reflection of her own suffering, a warning to her enemies, or just an honest expression of her devout belief in suffering as virtue? Perhaps all three. Mary's embroidery wasn't just craft, it was theology. Each stitch a prayer, each image a confession, each skull a sermon on the futility of earthly power. Which is a bit ironic for a woman trying so desperately to assert hers. And while history has mostly remembered her for the burnings, and fair enough, these quieter acts reveal something more layered. A queen who knew death intimately and who carried it not just in her policies, but in her pocket. But if Mary embroidered her grief, her great-great-granddaughter wore hers for decades. Even her staff wasn't allowed to wear anything else. 14. Queen Victoria's endless mourning dress code. In 1861, Prince Albert died. Queen Victoria never took off her mourning clothes again. Let's be clear, mourning wasn't unusual in the 19th century. Victorians turned grief into an aesthetic. Black crepe, jet jewellery, veils long enough to sweep the floor. It was a whole cultural economy. But what Victoria did was take it to the level of imperial policy. For the remaining 40 years of her reign, she wore black. Black dresses, black shawls, black bonnets. Her wardrobe became a monochrome monument to absence. But it wasn't just a personal decision. Victoria enforced her grief on those around her. Her court was ordered into black uniforms. Her ladies-in-waiting wore mourning attire. Servants, diplomats, even visiting dignitaries were often expected to observe suitable somberness. Mourning became not just fashion, but law. This wasn't a passive sadness, it was a statement. By dressing the entire monarchy in widowhood, Victoria transformed personal loss into political symbolism. She was no longer merely queen, she was the grieving mother of the empire, a figure of solemn endurance, a woman defined by what she had lost and refusing to move on. Of course, there were political benefits. The mourning image shielded her from criticism. It kept her above the fray of politics. It allowed her to withdraw from public life without abdicating. The black veil was not just a sign of sorrow, it was a strategic filter, but there was also something raw in it. Victoria kept Albert's room just as he left it. His clothes were laid out daily, his shaving water prepared each morning. This wasn't simply etiquette, it was ritual. Devotion turned compulsive. She barely spoke in public for years. She avoided social events. She resisted remarriage with near militant force, and all the while, the empire expanded under her name. Millions of subjects saw her only through the lens of mourning, as if Britannia herself had draped a veil over the globe. Her ministers complained, Parliament pleaded, newspapers speculated, but she held firm. Grief for Victoria was governance. Eventually a compromise emerged. She allowed brighter colours, slightly, for family weddings or select appearances. But she never truly stepped out of black. It was no longer clothing, it was identity. And in a court governed by solemnity, beauty became dangerous, particularly for those who dared to grow facial hair without royal permission. 15. Henry VIII's beard tax. If you thought the monarchy couldn't possibly regulate facial hair, you're underestimating Henry VIII. This is the man who rewrote religious law to divorce his wife, who tore through 6 marriages like chapters in a particularly dramatic novel, who believed himself both defender of the faith and its ultimate editor, and who, at some point between beheadings and ballads, decided that if you wanted to wear a beard in his kingdom, you'd have to pay for it. Yes, a beard tax. The rules were simple. If you had a beard, you owed the king. The exact pricing varied depending on status. Nobles paid more than commoners. Length and style might have played a role. Records are inconsistent, but the law was clear. Henry's treasury could benefit from your bristles. But this wasn't just about money, it was about power. Facial hair in Tudor England was more than just fashion. It was identity. Philosophers, nobles, soldiers, all wore beards as a sign of wisdom, masculinity, and gravitas. Henry himself sported a grand chestnut beard that he took great pride in. But he was also, as ever, deeply suspicious of anyone else appearing too confident, too independent, or too stylish on their own terms. So he monetized it. The message was clear: grow what you like, but I own your face. Like many of Henry's policies, the beard tax was unevenly enforced and largely symbolic. But the symbolism mattered. It reminded subjects that the king's authority reached literally to their chins, that fashion was not exempt from control, that even something as natural as hair could be weaponized as revenue and reminder. It also set a strange precedent. Future monarchs, including Elizabeth I and Peter the Great in Russia, would toy with similar ideas. But none did it with Henry's mix of theatricality and menace. He didn't just tax beards, he politicized them. And the irony, despite his obsession with appearances, Henry grew increasingly grotesque and isolated in his later years. His beard remained, his power too, but the man behind it began to unravel. Still, for a moment, England's beards were a matter of state, and every whisker had a price. Which brings us, fittingly, to a queen who didn't just tax beauty, she froze it stiff with egg whites and fear. 16. Elizabeth Foucault's egg white face stiffener. In an era without Botox, Queen Elizabeth first turned to breakfast, specifically egg whites, not to eat, but to glaze her face into what can only be described as a royal shell. This wasn't just vanity. This was the Tudor version of stage makeup, applied daily with a trembling devotion to illusion. The goal? Stillness, smoothness, immortality, ideally. Elizabeth's daily beauty ritual already involved layers of white lead, a deadly choice, but we've covered that. On top of this toxic canvas, she would brush egg whites across her skin, letting it dry into a delicate crust. The effect was porcelain-like, a pale, expressionless mask that shimmered under candlelight and discouraged movement. Smiling? Risky? Frowning? Unthinkable? Cracking your royal eggshell mid-audience? Absolutely not. This treatment was part of a broader strategy. Elizabeth understood that power, especially for a woman on the throne, was 80% performance and 20% survival. She styled herself not as a woman, but as an icon, the Virgin Queen, the living embodiment of England. Mortal concerns like wrinkles or pores didn't fit into that equation. The egg-white glaze served two purposes: aesthetic perfection and emotional control. It wasn't just about looking smooth, it was about being smooth, composed, untouchable. You couldn't flinch or sweat or smirk without shattering the illusion, quite literally. So the court adapted. People stopped expecting warmth. They complimented her stillness, her grace, her otherworldliness. Behind closed doors, they probably wondered what happened when it rained. But to Elizabeth, this wasn't a burden. It was armor. She knew how fragile the balance of power was, especially when her legitimacy was always under attack. The less human she appeared, the harder it was for anyone to challenge her. There's something tragic about it, too. The egg whites made her radiant, but also fragile, inhuman, alone. Her face became a mask, not just physically, but emotionally. What began as beauty became policy, then expectation, then prison. The irony? Her enemies called her vain, but there's nothing vain about being trapped inside your own mythology. Elizabeth didn't pamper herself, she preserved herself. Cracks were not allowed, not in paint, not in politics, and if commoners ever tried to mimic her style, they were punished. Which brings us to her flamboyant descendant, who decided that only the royals should shine. 17. Richard II's fashion police. Long before modern fashion weeks, there was Richard II, and he had no patience for anyone trying to outdress him. Richard came to the throne at age 10, which should tell you everything you need to know about how the rest of this is going to go. Surrounded by regents and rivals, he grew up in a court obsessed with ceremony, prestige, and image. And when he finally took the reins, he ruled not through strength or strategy, but through aesthetic domination. Richard's court was opulent: silk, gold thread, imported dyes, elaborate tailoring. It looked less like a medieval government and more like a Milan runway show. The king's personal style was flamboyant and curated down to the embroidery. He had coats that sparkled, hats that towered, and shoes with toes so long they needed to be tied to the knee with gold chains. But Richard wasn't content to be merely fashionable. He had to be the fashion. So, in one of the most delightfully petty royal edicts ever issued, he banned commoners, and even some nobles, from wearing certain fabrics, colours and styles. Velvet, reserved; purple, off-limits; gold thread, not unless you were in the king's personal circle. The idea was simple: if everyone looked rich, no one would know who was actually important. The hierarchy had to be visible. In Richard's world, clothing wasn't personal, it was political, and he was determined to be at the top of the textile food chain. This wasn't just a cultural moment, it was codified law. The statutes of apparel laid out strict guidelines on what you could and could not wear, based on rank, income, and royal favour. It was fashion fascism by royal decree. The irony, of course, is that Richard's obsession with status symbols made him wildly unpopular. While he posed in gilded robes, England was experiencing food shortages, tax revolts, and increasing unrest. Peasants didn't care about velvet bands, they cared about bread. Nobles bristled under his micromanagement. Parliament lost patience with his theatrical governing style, and eventually his cousin Henry Bolingbroke did what no tailor dared. He stripped Richard of his power and his crown. But Richard's legacy remained. He was one of the first English monarchs to understand that image could be weaponized, that politics could be worn, that when the sword fails, the hemline might just do the trick. He failed as a ruler, perhaps, but as a fashion icon, unquestionably ahead of his time. Of course, some royals were less concerned with tailoring and more confused about timing, like Anne of Cleves, who never quite got the hang of English etiquette or the difference between morning and night. 18. Anne of Cleves and her backward greetings. If ever there was a royal case study in cultural misfire, it was Anne of Cleves. She was Henry VIII's fourth wife, the one who didn't lose her head, which already makes her something of a Tudor success story. But before she survived her way into an annuity and countryside peace, Anne endured one of the most awkward royal arrivals in English history. Born and raised in the German Duchy of Cleves, Anne had no real experience with the English court, its language or its customs. Her marriage to Henry was a political arrangement, one of those classic "you two have never met, but you'll be husband and wife by Thursday" scenarios. Diplomatic matchmaking at its finest. Henry, eager to assess his bride-to-be in secret, famously disguised himself and barged into her chambers. Anne, who had no idea who the strange man was, reacted with the appropriate level of confusion and indifference. This was not, it turns out, Henry's favourite response. The king was offended, deeply, his ego bruised beyond repair. The marriage was doomed before it began. But Anne, blissfully unaware, continued her introduction to England with optimism. The problem? She didn't speak English. Not well. Not at all, really. She learned a few phrases. One of them was "good morning." Unfortunately, no one told her when to use it. She greeted people with "good morning" at night, at banquets, at moonlit dances, in candlelit halls. Courtiers were baffled. Was she being ironic? Was this a joke? A snub? No, she was just lost in translation. Anne's good intentions collided spectacularly with English snobbery. Every misstep, linguistic, cultural, or fashion-based, was magnified. Her gowns were mocked, her accent scrutinized, her behavior dissected, and through it all she kept smiling, probably still saying good morning at 9 p.m. Henry's verdict: she looked, in his words, like a Flanders mare. The marriage was annulled 6 months later. But here's the twist: that might have been the best thing to ever happen to Anne. Because once the marriage was over, Anne wasn't sent to a nunnery or worse. She was granted a generous settlement, 2 estates, and a new title, the king's beloved sister. She outlived all of Henry's other wives and got along surprisingly well with his children. No royal duties, no conjugal obligations, just peace, property, and plenty of time to figure out when to say good morning. So while she entered history as a failed queen, Anne of Cleves arguably played the long game better than anyone. She misunderstood the time of day, but she understood the value of getting out early. Next, we meet a queen whose sense of timing was always on point, particularly when it came to sniffing powdered tobacco at the royal breakfast table. 19. Queen Charlotte, the snuff-obsessed royal. In the realm of royal addictions, tea was common, brandy acceptable. But Queen Charlotte, wife of George III, took her daily ritual one step further, up the nostril. They called her Snuffy Charlotte, not behind her back, to her face, because she made it impossible not to notice. Charlotte was addicted to snuff, powdered tobacco meant to be elegantly inhaled through the nose, with all the delicacy of 18th century etiquette. But her version of elegance leaned heavily toward frequency. It wasn't a vice she indulged in discreetly behind closed doors. No, Charlotte snuffed everywhere, at court, during meals, even in bed. Her fingers were perpetually dusted with the fine greyish powder. Her gowns were stained from frequent usage. Her lace handkerchiefs were practically industrial tools. Snuff, to be fair, was fashionable at the time. Nobles across Europe carried ornate snuff boxes, each more elaborate than the last, and the act of taking a pinch was practically a performance. Raise the box, inhale, dab, sneeze, gracefully of course, and repeat. But Charlotte's habits were legendary for their volume, not their grace. She owned over 90 snuff boxes, each custom-made to match specific outfits. Some were encrusted with diamonds, others painted with miniature portraits of her family, her dogs, or the occasional flower arrangement. Wherever she went, a servant followed with the royal snuff box du jour, ready to deploy the next scented pinch of powdered relief. But this wasn't just about taste. Charlotte's obsession was medical too, or so she claimed. Snuff was believed to clear the head, prevent colds, and settle nerves. And Charlotte had plenty of nerves to settle. Married young to a king who would later suffer severe mental decline, she gave birth to 15 children, navigated the pressures of court, and was constantly scrutinized for not being beautiful enough to match her high-born German lineage. So she snuffed, and she didn't care who noticed. Foreign ambassadors were amused, courtiers whispered, artists painted her in idealized forms, omitting the telltale stains on her gloves. But Charlotte stayed firmly, defiantly herself, with a pinch of tobacco and zero concern for appearances. While others chased the era's impossible beauty standards, she made nasal habits into a royal trademark. And in a court where everyone was trying to look poised, Charlotte simply inhaled, sniffled, and let them talk. Next, we leave behind the powdered court for something colder, a king preparing for his own death in a way only the English could romanticize, with fashion, frost, and a refusal to shiver. 20. Charles I and the execution wardrobe. It was a bitter January morning in 1649 when Charles I prepared for his execution, and the only thing he seemed truly concerned about was shivering, not from fear, from cold, because if the people watching saw him tremble, he feared they'd mistake it for cowardice. And Charles I, last monarch before the brief English Republic, wasn't about to go down looking weak. So he wore 2 shirts. This wasn't vanity, it was strategy. Layers, after all, could keep a condemned king warm and composed. He might have been marching toward the scaffold, but he'd do it with dignity, no matter how theatrical or doomed the gesture. Charles's death was the climax of decades of escalating tension. His belief in the divine right of kings had clashed head-on with a parliament increasingly unwilling to fund his wars or indulge his ego. He dismissed parliament. They raised armies. The English Civil War erupted, and eventually the king lost, not just the war, but the power to rule at all. When he was sentenced to death, it marked the first time an English monarch had been publicly tried and executed by his own people. A moment of revolution. And Charles, oddly enough, embraced it as a final opportunity to perform one last act of royal theatre. He dressed meticulously. The extra shirt, a fine black cloak, a starched white collar, nothing too grand, no crown, no embroidery, but formal, intentional, regal. Accounts say he walked calmly to the scaffold, gave a speech affirming his innocence and his divine right, and forgave his executioner in advance. He even requested a shorter block so that he wouldn't have to kneel awkwardly. And as the axe fell, well, England changed forever. For a time, anyway. Charles's concern over public perception was not misplaced. Monarchs lived and died by image, and he knew that if his final moment looked weak, it would undermine everything he believed in, that a king was chosen by God, not Parliament. So he layered up, not just against the frost, but against failure. His death was his last chance to win the narrative, to die like a martyr, not a man. The irony? His enemies would use that same image to their advantage. The stoic king, bundled in dignity, became a symbol for royalists who opposed the Republic. A martyr, yes, but to whom? Even in death, Charles dressed for posterity. But he wasn't the only royal to think theatrically about endings. One of his descendants would literally collapse from indulgence, passed out and forgotten, until the diplomats arrived. 21. Henry VIII's wine-induced nap. It's often said that Henry VIII ruled with his stomach, but on at least one occasion his stomach ruled him, right into unconsciousness. The story goes like this. One evening, in the middle of yet another royal feast, one of those affairs with endless meat courses, overflowing goblets and more music than most weddings, Henry indulged. He overindulged. He committed to indulgence, so thoroughly in fact that he passed out on the floor, not in bed, not on a throne, right there in the middle of his private chambers. And unfortunately, it was just before a scheduled diplomatic audience. Panic ensued. Servants rushed in, horrified. The king, bloated, unconscious, snoring, had to be cleaned up, rearranged, and hidden before the foreign ambassadors arrived. Courtiers moved fast, concealing the wine stains, freshening the linens, and offering elaborate excuses for the delay. Someone even reportedly placed perfumed cloths around the room to cover the scent of royal overindulgence. The ambassadors were eventually received. The king revived. The incident quietly erased from official record. But of course, nothing stays hidden at court. Stories circulated, whispers spread. The great Henry, conqueror, reformer, head of the Church of England, brought low by his own appetite. The incident became an unspoken metaphor for his reign, grand, bloated, and occasionally unconscious to the consequences. Henry's excesses were famous, even in his own time. He drank heavily, feasted daily, and built his entire political legacy on having his desires gratified, in court, in marriage, in war. But moments like this exposed the man beneath the myth, a king too human to control his vices, a ruler who could be undone not by a sword, but by a goblet. Still, the machinery of monarchy rolled on. The feast continued, the throne remained upright, and Henry woke up none the wiser, or if he was, he didn't let it show. A little blackout never got in the way of a good banquet, and besides, he'd been far more humiliated before. This was just wine. At least he hadn't lost his teeth to sugar, like one of his descendants would, a queen who made dessert not just a preference, but a signature look. 22. Elizabeth I's sweet tooth and blackened smile. Royal teeth rarely make it into the portraits, which is lucky for Elizabeth I, because hers, by all accounts, were disastrous. The Virgin Queen had a serious sugar habit, not the casual post-dinner sweet tooth. We're talking full-blown statecraft sabotaging obsession. In an age when sugar was an expensive imported luxury, practically treated like gold, Elizabeth consumed it like a Tudor teenager with no parental supervision. Candied violets, preserved fruits, honeyed nuts, marzipan, gingerbread moulded into intricate shapes. Her banquet tables were overflowing with the stuff, and her teeth paid the price. By the end of her reign, observers noted that Elizabeth's once famous smile had turned blackened and decayed. In some reports, her teeth had fallen out altogether, and she struggled to speak clearly during court appearances. But rather than being horrified, the aristocracy followed her lead. Her courtiers, eager to show solidarity with their monarch, or perhaps just to appear fashionably diseased, took to blackening their own teeth with soot, cosmetics, or charcoal. You read that right. They copied her dental decline to look more royal. It's difficult to overstate how bizarre this is. In a court obsessed with appearance and power, the monarch's rotting smile somehow became a marker of elite status. Want to look noble? Black out your teeth. Want to appear common? Keep them white. Dental hygiene had become class warfare, Tudor style. This wasn't entirely new. Throughout history, rulers have always had the power to flip norms upside down. What they did, others did, no matter how objectively questionable. But Elizabeth took this to a new level. Her image was so unassailable, so deeply entrenched in myth and power, that even her personal decay became a fashion trend. And as always, Elizabeth leaned into the performance. She didn't try to hide her sweets. In fact, she was known for gifting sugar sculptures and elaborate candied gifts to foreign ambassadors. Her palaces were stocked with sugar artists who crafted edible art, swans, temples, even miniature castles, all designed to delight, impress, and rot your enamel in style. So when you picture Elizabeth I, don't just imagine the ruff, the pearls, or the crown. Imagine the molars, or what's left of them, a mouthful of royal ruin, sweetened by power and preserved by myth. And if you think that's odd, wait until you meet her father's least favourite plant, a monarch who reshaped religion, war, and marriage, but couldn't stand the smell of tobacco. 23. James I and the War on Tobacco. When James I of England inherited the throne in 1603, he also inherited a rising trend: tobacco. The New World export had become the European elite's favourite vice. It was exotic, it was expensive, and everyone who was anyone was either smoking it, sniffing it, or at least pretending to understand the appeal. Everyone, that is, except James. He hated it, hated the smell, hated the taste, hated the very idea of it. And unlike many monarchs who muttered their disapproval in private, James took the nuclear option. He wrote an entire pamphlet about how much he despised the stuff. It was called A Counterblast to Tobacco, and it reads less like royal decree and more like an enraged Yelp review. He called tobacco a custom loathsome to the eye, hateful to the nose, harmful to the brain, dangerous to the lungs. And that was just the opening salvo. To James, smoking wasn't just a bad habit. It was an assault on decency. He believed it turned men into beasts, corrupted morals, and drained the kingdom's wealth. He even accused smokers of mimicking barbarous foreign cultures, a little imperialist cherry on top of his fiery disapproval. Naturally, the court was baffled. Tobacco was all the rage. Sir Walter Raleigh had popularized it. Poets wrote odes to it. Nobles hosted tobacco-themed parties. But James, he saw a kingdom of wheezing, ash-covered aristocrats and said, enough. He didn't just rant. He taxed. He levied increasingly heavy duties on imported tobacco, hoping to price the product out of reach. Smugglers, of course, found ways around it, and the king, increasingly frustrated, doubled down. By the end of his reign, his anti-tobacco stance was so infamous that it became almost a joke among foreign diplomats. One ambassador reportedly claimed that meeting James was like sitting before a furnace of moral fury. The irony, despite all his blustering tobacco use, only increased during his reign. England's appetite for the leaf proved stronger than royal disgust. James may have won the rhetorical battle, but he lost the cultural war. Still, his pamphlet survives, a literary monument to a monarch's personal pet peeve turned policy. And perhaps that's the real lesson. You can rewrite the Bible as James did, but you can't get people to give up their cigars. Which brings us to his son, a king who went in the opposite direction. Not moral outrage, but indulgence. Not rejection, but cocoa-fueled obsession. 24. Charles II and his royal chocolate habit. Charles II was a man of appetites, for parties, for poetry, for mistresses, and yes, for chocolate. Not bars, not truffles. This was hot chocolate. Thick, spiced, exotic. Imported from the New World and whisked with sugar, cinnamon and cream until it became a drink fit for a decadent, politically ambivalent restoration monarch. Charles loved it so much that he hired his own personal chocolate maker, a royal chocolatier, if you will. It was a formal court appointment, complete with a salary, a kitchen and strict duties. Because if you were going to restore the monarchy after a civil war, you might as well restore its dessert game too. The chocolate wasn't just a treat, it was a statement. In a time when England was redefining its monarchy after the strict austerity of Cromwell's Commonwealth, Charles turned luxury into politics. His court was a deliberate rejection of Puritan sobriety. He wanted it loud, opulent, overflowing with music, dance, and yes, cocoa. Hot chocolate became a regular feature of his morning routine. He drank it upon waking. He served it at court functions. He used it to impress foreign dignitaries. It was considered a health drink at the time, an energizer, an aphrodisiac, even a cure-all. And Charles, a man who never said no to pleasure dressed as science, embraced all of it. His chocolate kitchen at Hampton Court Palace still exists, a beautifully preserved chamber with marble-topped tables and antique whisks. It stands today as a sweet little time capsule of royal indulgence. But there's a darker edge to the story too. Chocolate was exotic, yes, but it was also colonial. Its journey to the King's Cup involved plantations, enslaved labour, and the vast machinery of imperial extraction. The luxury Charles enjoyed so casually came at enormous human cost, a fact rarely mentioned in the shimmering courts of Restoration England. So when you picture Charles II, tall with flowing black curls, lounging in silks and toying with his spaniels, don't forget the cup of hot chocolate in his hand, rich imported, stirred by servants, symbol of status, comfort and quiet imperial violence. And unlike his father, Charles wasn't interested in controlling people's habits. He just wanted to sweeten them. Of course, some monarchs sweetened too much, and their carriages had to be structurally reinforced to carry the results. Which brings us fittingly to the next chapter, the tale of George IV and his beef-fueled battle with gravity. 25. George IV and the reinforced carriage. George IV had many titles: King of the United Kingdom, Prince Regent, fashion icon, catastrophic romantic, but light traveller was never one of them. By the time he inherited the throne, George had eaten, drunk, and styled his way into a state that can best be described as architecturally significant. Specifically, his personal mass required architectural adjustment to his carriage. This was no ordinary royal coach. It was a specially reinforced, custom-built marvel of 19th century engineering designed to carry one very large king and his entourage of scandal. The suspension was strengthened, the wheels widened, the undercarriage braced. Royal sources were polite. They described it as lavishly appointed and durable. But the message was clear. This was a vehicle built for weight, both physical and symbolic. George IV's obsession with food had begun long before his coronation. As Prince Regent, he hosted extravagant dinners that would put Versailles to shame. His personal chefs trained in Paris. Entire menus were built around his whims. Roast beef and his favourite appeared at every sitting, often in absurd quantity. It was said he could polish off 6 or more dishes in a single meal, not counting dessert. And those desserts, sculptures of spun sugar and almond paste, as excessive as the man himself. He was also partial to sauces, thick, buttery, spiced concoctions that turned simple meat into culinary theatre. Guests at his dinners didn't just eat, they waded through gastronomy. Napkins were more like shields. Inevitably, the consequences caught up. His waistline expanded. His joints ached. He could no longer mount a horse without assistance, so he preferred to be seen in his carriage, rolling through the parks with as much grandeur as his reinforced wheels could muster. The public watched all this with a mix of fascination and ridicule. Satirical prints depicted him as a grotesque balloon of vanity. Nicknames like the Prince of Wales circulated in pamphlets and pubs, but George, ever defiant, leaned into the performance. If he couldn't be slim, he'd be stylish. If he couldn't be fit, he'd be fabulous. The carriage became a symbol, not of burden, but of entitlement. The monarchy, as embodied by George IV, didn't shrink from extravagance. It expanded into it. And though his health deteriorated, heart disease, gout, and layers of indulgence taking their toll, his legend remained mobile, powered by wheels that groaned under the weight of royal appetite. But if George IV rolled through life with spectacle, another king met his end at the dinner table, or rather after it. A meal of eels, a taste for danger, and a very medieval misunderstanding of food safety. 26. Henry I and the Fatal Eels. It's one of the oldest cautionary tales in English royal history. Don't eat the lampreys. Or more specifically, don't eat too many lampreys, especially if you're Henry I, youngest son of William the Conqueror, seasoned ruler, and by all accounts, a glutton for very specific seafood. Lampreys, for the uninitiated, are not exactly fish. They're jawless, eel-like creatures with unsettling circular mouths full of teeth, beloved by medieval monarchs and feared by modern diners. In the 12th century, they were considered delicacies, dangerous ones. Henry IV loved them, really loved them. His physicians repeatedly warned him they were bad for his digestion, but like most warnings given to monarchs, they were politely ignored. One day, during a royal visit to Normandy in 1135, Henry sat down to a particularly lavish meal and, ignoring every red flag waving from his medical staff, devoured a large plate of lampreys. The next morning, he was dead. The chroniclers didn't mince words. He died from a surfeit of lampreys, they wrote. Surfeit, an elegant medieval euphemism for he overdid it, whether it was actual food poisoning, a reaction to the richness, or a coincidental medical event masked by culinary excess, we'll never know. But the legend stuck. Henry I, King of England, killed by his favourite dish. His court descended into chaos. With no legitimate male heir, the succession crisis that followed plunged England into a civil war, the period known as the anarchy, where nobles fought over control and the throne bounced back and forth like a cursed game of musical chairs. And all of it, people whispered, because of an eel. Lampreys didn't fall out of fashion immediately. In fact, they remained a royal dish for centuries. Even Queen Elizabeth II reportedly received one as a coronation gift, though we can assume she declined to replicate Henry's dinner choice. The tale endures not because of the dish itself, but because it so perfectly captures the intersection of royalty, hubris, and indigestion. A monarch, powerful and seasoned, failed not by enemy blades or treasonous plots, but by dinner. It's almost poetic, almost Shakespearean. A reminder that kings may rule nations, but no one escapes the consequences of bad seafood. And while Henry I met his end via overindulgence, one of his descendants took a different approach to food, turning it into art. Jellies that wobbled like empires, castles made of meat, and a cook with the nation's first royal title. 27. Richard II and the Jelly Architect. In the glittering mess that was Richard II's reign, one of his lesser-known and somehow more endearing legacies is this. He hired the first officially titled royal cook, not just a kitchen hand or banquet manager. A proper, dignified, salaried culinary artist tasked with feeding the king and dazzling the court. This cook's primary claim to fame? Elaborate jellies. Yes, jellies. But before you imagine a wobbly blob of lime green nonsense, understand that medieval jellies were high art. They were made from clarified broth, thickened with boiled animal parts, yes really, and coloured with flowers, herbs, or, if the budget allowed, crushed gemstones and gold leaf. Think transparent sculptures of animals, crests, castles, and religious scenes shimmering with surreal beauty and probably slightly unsettling texture. Under Richard II's direction, these weren't just food, they were performance. One banquet featured jellied swans, posed mid-flight. Another displayed a miniature St. Paul's Cathedral made of moulded eel aspic. Each dish was meant to elicit awe, reverence, and the occasional startled gasp. Guests didn't eat right away. They looked, they admired, they talked about it the way we now talk about immersive art installations. Why jelly, though? Because Richard II, for all his political failings, was obsessed with image. He wanted to rule not just with power, but with pageantry. His court was the most extravagant in medieval Europe. Tapestries, golden goblets, rare spices, Italian fabrics, and in the middle of it all, shimmering, quivering monuments to royal creativity. It said that foreign dignitaries returned home and spoke not just of Richard's politics, but his menus. The food was diplomacy. The jellies were soft power. But the symbolism cuts both ways. Jelly, after all, is unstable, beautiful but vulnerable, easy to sculpt, easier to destroy. Just like Richard's reign, his extravagance alienated the nobility. His reforms, though often forward-thinking, were poorly timed. Eventually, his cousin Henry Bolingbroke returned from exile and seized the throne, deposing Richard with more permanence than any collapsing jelly tower. Still, the cook's legacy lived on. The role of royal chef became institutionalized, and culinary artistry, especially when it came to impressing and intimidating, remained a staple of monarchy for centuries. All thanks to a king who wanted his dinner to sparkle. And if Richard II turned jelly into power, the next monarch used food for something far more primal, passion. A king whose appetite extended beyond the plate, to Paris, pleasure, and having entire menus named after him. 28. Edward VII, the monarch who ate Paris. Before he became king, Edward VII, or Bertie, as his mother Victoria called him in that disappointed tone she seemed to reserve just for him, was Europe's most decadent dinner guest. Where his mother ruled in black mourning and self-denial, Bertie ruled in butter. And in Paris, they built him a throne out of foie gras. Edward wasn't just a gourmand. He was the gourmand, so much so that restaurants across Paris invented dishes just for him. Crêpes Suzette, rumoured to be born at his table, tornados Rossini, repeatedly perfected under his watch, sauces, reductions, courses so indulgent they required a second jacket. If Edward liked it, it made the menu. He adored French cuisine, loved its elegance, its performance, the theatre of dining. He would sit for hours, course after course, puffing cigars between bites, pairing wine like a sommelier with a crown. He didn't just eat meals, he curated them. and his favourite venue, Maxim's, the legendary Parisian restaurant where velvet booths, scandalous liaisons, and a bottomless wine cellar made every night feel like the world's most expensive mistake. Edward had a special table. Staff knew his orders by heart. Chefs tested recipes in his honour, but this wasn't mindless indulgence, it was image building. Edward, long denied real political power by his mother's insistence on eternal grief, turned himself into an icon of charm, style and taste. He couldn't rule yet, but he could host, and in the salons of Paris that mattered almost as much. There were, of course, consequences. His weight ballooned, his health faltered, chairs groaned when he sat. But Paris didn't mind. They kept cooking, because Bertie wasn't just a royal tourist, he was their patron saint of appetite. He once famously remarked, "A dinner which ends without cheese is like a beautiful woman with only one eye." That says everything, really. Crude, a bit absurd, and yet somehow poetic. Later, when he became king, Edward VII would help smooth diplomatic relations with France in what became known as the Entente Cordiale, a significant political achievement, but one that arguably began with wine pairings and dessert menus. Soft power, one bite at a time. And while Edward made food his political love language, one of his predecessors had more theatrical tastes, including birds served with feathers reapplied after roasting. Dinner for some kings was dinner. For Henry VIII, it was pageantry. 29. Henry VIII and his feathered feasts. Most monarchs eat swan once to say they've done it. Henry VIII served them reassembled. In a move that perfectly captures the surreal grandeur of the Tudor court, Henry didn't just eat exotic animals, he demanded they be presented in full costume. At his most ostentatious banquets, guests were greeted by roasted peacocks and swans, dressed in their own feathers. The birds were cooked, cleaned, and then recloaked in their plumes for maximum visual impact. It was like culinary taxidermy, designed to say, "This isn't food, this is art." Also, yes, it's definitely dead. It sounds bizarre, and it was, but it wasn't just about flair. This was royal propaganda in edible form. The swan, long a symbol of nobility and grace, became Henry's centerpiece. The peacock, all glitter and pride, mirrored his self-image. These weren't meals, they were metaphors. Eat the symbol, own the meaning. At the Tudor table, nothing was just dinner. Food was theatre, and Henry, he was the director. The process itself was elaborate. After roasting, the birds were carefully cooled so their skin wouldn't ruin the reapplication. Feathers were stitched back on, beaks reattached, eyes glossed. Sometimes they were propped upright, wings spread, sometimes posed in flight. They didn't just lie on platters, they loomed. Guests were expected to marvel, to applaud, to eat. The king's appetite was legendary, and not just for drama. He consumed vast amounts of meat daily, often without vegetables. His kitchens employed entire staffs just to butcher, roast and serve. The court at Hampton Court required over 600 mouths fed per day, and everything had to revolve around the king's palate. But the feathered birds, those were special occasions, state visits, marriages, triumphs, the edible equivalent of fireworks. And while modern sensibilities might cringe, the effect was undeniable. Foreign ambassadors wrote breathless letters home. Nobles returned to their own estates with wildly inflated expectations. It wasn't just gluttony, it was branding. Yet ironically, Henry's rule and his body eventually collapsed under its own weight. But for a time, he reigned not just as sovereign of a realm, but of spectacle. A man who didn't just demand loyalty, but awe, even from a dinner plate. And speaking of exotic flavors, one of his descendants developed a craving so specific, so un-British, it reshaped the royal kitchen forever with curry. 30. Queen Victoria and her curry obsession. Of all the unexpected things Queen Victoria loved, mourning, pugs and painfully awkward family letters, perhaps none is as quietly fascinating as her deep, passionate affection for curry. Yes, curry. Not just the occasional spoonful at a diplomatic reception, we're talking daily servings. She adored the complex spice, the warmth, the escape it offered from the grey-scale world of boiled British cuisine. Victoria's curry habit wasn't a passing fad. It was a permanent fixture of her dining table, and at the centre of this culinary love story was Abdul Karim, her Indian attendant, servant, friend, and, depending on who you asked, a highly controversial presence in court. He arrived in 1887, intended as a symbolic gesture during the Queen's Golden Jubilee, but within months he had become her munshi, her teacher in Urdu, her bridge to Indian culture, and crucially, her personal curry chef. He cooked dishes to her taste, rich but not overpowering, spicy but not aggressive. Victoria, famously hard to impress, was enchanted. She began to request Indian meals regularly. Chicken curry, dal, chapatis, all lovingly prepared by Karim and his small staff. Her diaries are filled with references to the food, to the joy of it, the comfort, the warmth in every sense. Naturally, the court was scandalized, not by the curry itself, though that certainly raised powdered eyebrows, but by the munshi's growing influence. He was a commoner, he was foreign, he was close, and the Queen's devotion to him, including her insistence that he dine with her and receive royal honours, upended every unspoken rule of Victorian decorum. Still, she defended him, kept him at her side, learned from him, and yes, ate his food. Curry became more than a dish. It was a political symbol, a cultural bridge, and a quiet rebellion. Victoria, Empress of India, was tasting the empire, not as conquest, but as connection. By the end of her reign, Indian cuisine had infiltrated royal life to the point that future generations would continue serving it on special occasions. But no one embraced it quite like Victoria. In her palace of mourning, with her black gowns and somber rituals, curry was something bright, alive in ways she herself was often not allowed to be. And if food can be memory, then perhaps hers were spiced with something deeper. The flavour of a world far from Windsor, yet brought so close it lingered in every bite. And next, a king who preferred gardens over governance, ditches over diplomacy, and mud over monarchy. 31. Edward II and his love of ditches. Every king has his hobbies. Some preferred poetry, others warfare. But Edward II, son of Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, had a peculiar love affair with manual labour. The man loved ditches, not metaphorically, not in the poetic sense. Edward II literally enjoyed digging them, with his own hands, in the dirt, wearing royal garments not quite suited for mud, while courtiers looked on in confused horror. At first, they thought it was a passing curiosity, some noble fantasy about connecting with the common man. A few afternoons of raking mud with the peasants before returning to the throne for wine and protocol. But Edward kept doing it, and not just ditches. He helped thatch roofs, repaired walls, hung out with carpenters and labourers, chatting like old friends. To the noble elite, this was deeply unsettling. The King of England was not supposed to be seen hauling stones or shoveling soil like a serf. It blurred the lines of divine hierarchy. The social order trembled slightly every time he picked up a spade. And yet, Edward was happy. He laughed more with farmers than with barons. He seemed more relaxed in a muddy field than in Parliament. And unlike the stiff, cold rule of his father, who was famously severe and militaristic, Edward preferred company that didn't care about heraldry or land grants. He liked the simple folk, the ones who didn't bow too deeply or quote Cicero at dinner. Of course, this didn't exactly endear him to the aristocracy. They already found Edward strange, too emotionally open, too attached to his favourites, too disinterested in the grim business of war. His ditch-digging antics became symbolic of what they saw as his broader failure to act like a king. England, they argued, needed a warrior, not a gardener, and they weren't entirely wrong. Edward's reign was a mess, filled with factionalism, rebellion, and military humiliation. He was ultimately deposed by his own wife and her lover, a betrayal that still echoes through royal history, but his ditch-digging remains oddly humanizing. In a sea of gilded portraits and divine right manifestos, here was a king who liked honest work, who found comfort not in conquest but in compost, who, for all his political failings, may have been the only medieval monarch who genuinely enjoyed getting his hands dirty. In another life, Edward II might have made an excellent groundskeeper. Instead, he made history as the king who preferred a shovel to a sword. And speaking of royal missteps, our next queen didn't lose her head or her crown. She just lost the crowd. One wrong price hike, one angry mob, and Elizabeth I had found herself caught in the crosshairs of the very people she claimed to protect. 32. Elizabeth I and the Wheat Riot. It's easy to think of Elizabeth I as untouchable. The glittering portraits, the ruff the size of a dinner table, the steely gaze of a woman who crushed rebellions and stared down kings. But on at least one occasion, Gloriana came face to face with something even more terrifying than foreign invaders or palace intrigue, an angry mob of Londoners who couldn't afford their bread. It started, as these things often do, with a price increase. The cost of wheat, the grain that fed the entire nation, had risen sharply due to a bad harvest. But the people didn't blame the weather, they blamed the crown, or more precisely, the crown's policies. Grain hoarding by nobles, export deals that prioritized profit over local need, and the general sense that the elite were dining just fine while the poor starved. Then came the Queen's coach. On a ride through London, one of her rare appearances meant to display royal closeness with her subjects. Elizabeth's carriage was suddenly surrounded. The crowd surged, not with admiration, not with roses or reverence, with rage. They screamed, they pounded on the wood, some threw mud, others spit. Elizabeth's guards formed a barrier. The coachman whipped the horses. The Queen, famously composed, sat in silence. One can only imagine the flicker of recognition behind her famously powdered face. This wasn't about policy. This was personal. She'd styled herself as the people's queen, the mother of the realm, the Protestant saviour of England, and yet here she was, barricaded inside a golden box while her people demanded bread. The incident was downplayed, of course. Official records frame it as a minor disturbance. Courtiers whispered about excessive passion among the rabble. But in private, Elizabeth was rattled. Reports suggest she called an emergency session with her council. Emergency grain shipments were arranged. Public proclamations were issued promising fair prices. And just like that, the narrative was respun. The Queen had heard her people. She was their guardian once again. But the crack in the image remained. For all her brilliance, Elizabeth was not immune to the consequences of economic neglect. Her court may have been a jewel box of poetry, fashion, and strategy. But outside the palace walls, bread mattered more than metaphors. And this was the great paradox of her reign. Adored and feared, elegant and ruthless, untouchable and almost touched. A sovereign on a pedestal, until the price of wheat dropped and reality knocked on the carriage door. Next, we meet a king who really shouldn't have gotten on that horse. A man trying to impress a woman reclaims some masculinity and accidentally joust himself into oblivion. 33. Henry VIII and the joust that nearly killed him. By the time Henry VIII tried to win Anne Boleyn's heart with a joust, he already had 6 palaces, an entire kingdom, and the self-esteem of 3 men stacked in a coat of arms. But Anne wasn't impressed. She was sharp, ambitious, and uninterested in becoming another Tudor mistress. Henry, ever the showman, decided to escalate. If courtly flirtation didn't work, perhaps a full-contact medieval sport would do the trick. So he mounted a horse, donned the armor, and entered the jousting arena. Now jousting wasn't just a romantic gesture, it was dangerous. A brutal, full-speed collision between 2 men wielding 12-foot lances. But for Henry, it was worth the risk. He was still young, still muscular, still the golden-haired embodiment of Renaissance masculinity. And nothing says "marry me" like a controlled act of violence in front of your entire court. The match began. Then came the moment. A sudden charge, a missed timing, a flailing arm, and then Henry was on the ground. The horse had rolled, the armor crushed into him. Witnesses claimed he lay unconscious for 2 hours. Some feared he was dead. Anne, watching from the gallery, reportedly went pale. The court panicked. Physicians rushed in. Prayers were muttered. And just as plans were forming for a succession crisis, Henry woke up. The king had survived, but something in him had shifted. His physical injuries were brushed off publicly, but whispers began that the blow to the head had changed his mood, his energy, even his personality. Some historians now suggest this was the turning point, the moment when the charming, athletic prince began to transform into the paranoid, erratic tyrant we now associate with the later Henry. As for Anne, she was moved, impressed even. Their courtship intensified. Within a few years, she was queen, and then, as we know, she was something else entirely. But in that moment, dusty, dramatic, reckless, Henry VIII was just a man trying to win a woman with spectacle, and almost losing everything in the process. Which leads us to another royal who had a deep attachment to trees. Not forests, not parks, one specific oak, and he wasn't taking any chances with its hydration. 34. George III and the watered oak tree. When most kings worried about their legacy, George III worried about an oak tree. It wasn't just any oak. To him, it was sacred, a living symbol of strength, permanence, perhaps even sanity, a rare commodity in a life that would become defined by its unraveling. And so, while his ministers fretted about colonial rebellions and mounting debt, George issued an order. The royal gardeners were to water the tree daily, not seasonally, not when dry, every day. There's no official record explaining why he chose this particular oak, no plaque or decree to clarify the significance. But for George, a man whose mind blurred between the spiritual and the symbolic, it meant something. Perhaps it reminded him of childhood, or of stability, or perhaps, in a more metaphysical sense, he believed the tree was a kind of anchor, a rooted thing, when he no longer felt rooted himself. It's easy to reduce this to eccentricity, and indeed many did. The same king who would later talk to trees in Windsor Park, who scribbled compulsively during bouts of mental illness, and who was quietly removed from power during his worst episodes. Yes, this fits the narrative, but it's also more poignant than that. George III was not a fool. He was meticulous, intelligent, and profoundly dutiful. He read every bill placed before him. He believed in personal virtue and national responsibility, and perhaps that's what made his devotion to the tree so telling. When everything else was slipping, colonies, parliament, his own mind, he clung to the one thing that stayed in place. The oak, after all, didn't argue. It didn't accuse him of madness. It didn't betray him politically. It just stood there. And so he gave it water every day. The gardeners were baffled. Some grumbled. Others quietly ignored the order, then pretended compliance. But the king followed up. Did you water the tree? Was it properly done? He wasn't joking. He meant it. In the grand scheme of royal obsessions, this one seems harmless, even sweet, but like most of George's quirks, it carries a shadow. A reminder that even the most powerful among us will eventually search for stability in strange places. And speaking of strange places, one royal ancestor of his would eventually be found beneath one, a monarch lost for centuries, rediscovered beneath something as mundane as a parking lot. 35. Richard III and the parking lot discovery. For over 500 years, the final resting place of Richard III was a mystery, the kind of historical footnote often glossed over in textbooks. He died in battle in 1485, his body dragged from the field, humiliated by the victors, and supposedly buried in a friary in Leicester. Then the friary was demolished, the city grew, the centuries turned, and Richard, he vanished. Until 2012. It started, like all great discoveries, with obsession. A woman named Philippa Langley, a writer and amateur historian, became convinced that Richard's remains were beneath a council car park in Leicester. She had no hard proof, just a trail of forgotten maps, architectural intuition, and a deeply held belief that the king had been buried under what had become, over time, a tarmac-slabbed parking bay labelled "R. She raised money." She got permission, and then, on the first day of digging, like a scene straight from historical fantasy, they found bones. The archaeological team was cautious, could be anyone, but as the bones were exhumed, analysed and dated, the evidence began to mount. Male, mid-30s, severe scoliosis, battle injuries consistent with historical accounts. And then DNA testing sealed it. Through a long line of descendants, Richard III was confirmed, a lost king found beneath a car park. The headlines wrote themselves, from crown to concrete. Parking lot king. Memes exploded. Shakespearean scholars perked up. History teachers rewrote lesson plans, and for a brief, surreal moment, Richard III became a pop culture phenomenon. But beyond the novelty, the discovery reignited debate about the man himself. Was he the villain of Shakespeare's tragedy? The hunchbacked usurper who murdered nephews and clawed for power? Or had he been smeared by Tudor propaganda, rewritten by the winners of history to fit a dramatic mould? His remains, oddly dignified in their rediscovery, seemed to whisper a different story. One of tragedy, perhaps, of defeat, of lost legacy. He was reburied in 2015 with full honours in Leicester Cathedral. A solemn service, royal representatives, a proper tomb, and a gentle nod to the irony that for centuries people had literally driven over his grave without knowing it. Richard III, reduced in life, lost in death, and finally refound, not by kings, but by amateur historians and municipal permits, which in some poetic twist feels fitting, because while some kings spent lifetimes constructing legacy, others simply waited to be dug up. And now we turn to a king whose legacy was tall in more ways than one, a man so physically imposing he needed custom everything, including his own legend. 36. Edward IV, the Giant King. When people first laid eyes on Edward IV, they didn't see a king, they saw a giant. Towering over 6 feet 4 inches tall, Edward IV was the kind of man who didn't need a crown to be noticed. In a 15th century world, where the average height hovered somewhere around 5.5 feet, Edward's presence was literally larger than life. He wasn't just the tallest English monarch, he was the most physically commanding king of his era, and he knew it. Contemporaries wrote about his godlike figure, his broad shoulders, his shining armour that gleamed like a knight from myth. Battle-hardened and glamorously brutal, he looked like a hero from a stained glass window, assuming that hero had an eye for fine clothing and a notorious reputation with women. He wasn't born to inherit the throne easily. The Wars of the Roses had splintered England into factions, and Edward clawed his way to power through military brilliance, political marriage, and brute charisma. At just 19 years old, he led troops into battle and crushed his enemies with a confidence that stunned both allies and foes. But it wasn't just his sword that won hearts. His looks became propaganda. Artists captured his towering frame in armour and furs. Poems were written about his golden hair. Women fell hard. Men followed him. His court became the most fashion-forward in Europe, and Edward revelled in it. He wasn't just a king, he was a walking monument to male beauty. And with that beauty came controversy. His love life was, in a word, complicated. Secret marriages, court scandals, whispered affairs. His most famous romantic twist came when he secretly married Elizabeth Woodville, a commoner and widow, stunning his court and enraging his advisers, who had hoped for a politically strategic union. But Edward, ever confident, simply did it anyway. His height wasn't just physical, it was metaphorical. He stood above convention, above compromise, and eventually above his own limitations, because despite the glory, Edward's reign wasn't without cracks. He struggled with maintaining alliances, faced rebellion from his own brother, the infamous George, Duke of Clarence, who supposedly met his end in a barrel of wine, and battled declining health in his later years. When he died at just 40, England was once again thrown into chaos. The Wars of the Roses reignited. His sons disappeared, the infamous princes in the Tower. His legacy, like his body, cast a long shadow over a nation still unsure whether power should come from blood, charisma, or simply being the biggest guy in the room. Next, we meet a king who, in the middle of parliamentary debates, chose the company of his dogs over the people running the country. Because if you had to pick between spaniels and squabbling MPs, wouldn't you? 37. Charles II and the Spaniel Parliament. In most monarchies, when Parliament is in session, the king listens, sometimes grudgingly, sometimes with daggers in his eyes. But he listens because that's the job. Charles II had other priorities, like his dogs, not just any dogs, his beloved Cavalier King Charles Spaniels, the breed that still carries his name. Floppy-eared, wide-eyed, and utterly spoiled, these dogs didn't just live in the palace, they attended meetings, official ones, government ones, parliament ones. There were accounts whispered in court, chuckled about in satire, of Charles sitting on the throne, surrounded by papers, while at least 2 of his spaniels snoozed at his feet or climbed onto his lap during debates. Members of Parliament tried to keep their composure while the king scratched behind the ears of his canine companions and ignored the tedious ramblings about taxes, succession, or the occasional national crisis. If one barked, Charles would hush them lovingly. If they snored, he smiled. If they ran under tables, well, better than another civil war, right? It would be charming if it weren't also symbolic. Charles came to power after a brutal, soul-scraping period of English history, the beheading of his father, Charles I, the English Civil War, and the Cromwellian interregnum, a time when the monarchy was abolished, music was banned, and joy was generally illegal. When Charles was restored to the throne in 1660, he wasn't just restoring a monarchy, he was restoring fun, and dogs were part of the deal. To Charles, the spaniels weren't just pets, they were comfort. Companions from exile, reminders of simpler pleasures, creatures who didn't lie, plot, or rebel. Unlike ministers, they didn't demand titles. Unlike Parliament, they didn't ask for funding. They just wanted to nap. His court became a place of indulgence, theatre, music, art, flirtation, a royal bubble where distraction became the royal strategy. The dogs were a perfect metaphor for this new style of rule, friendly, loyal, well-groomed, and mostly disinterested in actual governance. Of course, the dogs caused their share of chaos. They left messes on palace floors. They disrupted ceremonies. Foreign diplomats were reportedly nipped at the ankles during tense discussions, but Charles didn't care. To him, they were family. And perhaps, after watching his own father executed by a country that lost all sense of affection, Charles chose loyalty, even if it came on 4 legs. So, while Parliament debated the fate of the realm, the king threw a ball for his dogs, or let them sit in his lap while he pretended to listen. It might not have been good politics, but it was undeniably good therapy. Next, we move from barking dogs to roaring bears, because Elizabeth I didn't just reign over England, she reigned over an empire of blood sport, including one very grumpy bear in the Tower of London. 38. Elizabeth I and her bear at the Tower. Long before Buckingham Palace tours and corgi Christmas cards, the English monarchy had a different kind of animal attraction, bear baiting. And Elizabeth I didn't just tolerate it, she loved it. So much so that she kept her own personal bear in the Tower of London, not in some whimsical royal zoo enclosure, but as part of the grisly entertainment circuit that passed for a good afternoon in Tudor England. This wasn't an exotic pet or a novelty gift from some far-flung diplomat. This was a working bear, part of the state-sponsored sport that pitted animals against each other in brutal arenas, often with cheering crowds, betting nobles, and the Queen herself in attendance. Imagine the scene. The Queen of England, decked in pearls, her face powdered like porcelain, her eyes scanning the crowd, nods in approval as a bear fends off chained dogs for the amusement of the court. To modern ears, it's barbaric. To Elizabethan England, it was Tuesday. The bear at the Tower was more than a pet. It was a performer, a symbol, a piece of living, snarling propaganda. Elizabeth's love of bear baiting was widely known, and she often hosted foreign guests at events where the bear took center stage. It wasn't just sport. It was branding, a show of strength, of tradition, of a ruler who could enjoy the blood and roar and still hold court in flawless Latin. And the Tower of London? It was the perfect venue. A fortress, a prison, a place where power and violence coexisted as naturally as breath. The bear, chained or caged between performances, became part of the Tower's legend, a dark echo of the monarchy's appetite for control, for performance, for spectacle. There's no record of the bear's name, no tombstone, no tribute, just accounts of its presence, of its role, and of Elizabeth's fondness for the game. She once even refused to ban a public bear baiting event because it conflicted with a sermon. The sermon was postponed, the bear won, and in that moment the priorities of the Elizabethan monarchy became clear. It wasn't all pearls and poetry, it was blood, muscle, and myth. The Queen who refused to marry, who styled herself as England's Virgin Mother, had no problem watching a chained animal fight for its life and clapping when it did well. Power, for Elizabeth, was performance, and her bear, just another actor in the never-ending play of monarchy. But while Elizabeth enjoyed violence from a royal balcony, one of her ancestors preferred something a bit more competitive, like tennis, high stakes, emotionally charged, and worth smashing your racket over. 39. Henry VIII and the Great Tennis Tantrum. Before he became the swollen tyrant of six wives' infamy, Henry VIII was the ultimate Renaissance jock. He hunted, he jousted, he rode horses like he was born in the saddle. But among all his athletic pursuits, real tennis, the indoor, complex, aristocratic ancestor of modern lawn tennis, held a special place in his competitive, ever-flaring heart. Henry didn't just play tennis, he bet on it. He wagered enormous sums of money, sometimes the equivalent of a noble's annual income, on a single match. His court knew better than to play half-heartedly. You didn't just hit the ball, you performed devotion, and you lost carefully. But not everyone got the memo. And on one infamous occasion, Henry lost, badly. The match, court records suggest, was meant to be light entertainment, a friendly bout in the palace's elaborate tennis court. But the king miscalculated, or perhaps his opponent was too good, or perhaps someone had the gall to actually beat him honestly. Whatever the case, Henry lost, and in front of spectators. The reaction? Not subtle. He reportedly stormed off the court in a fury, smashed his racket against a wall, and declared that the entire sport, or at least the court, was beneath royal dignity. Courtiers pretended not to notice. Ministers suddenly had urgent business elsewhere, and the unlucky opponent probably invented an emergency hunting trip. It wasn't just about losing, it was about losing face. Henry's ego, already supersized by divine right and personal charm, couldn't absorb defeat, especially in a game he considered part of his identity. To be outplayed was to be dethroned, even for an afternoon. And yet the story spread. Because in a court where fear reigned and flattery was currency, these rare glimpses of royal tantrum became unofficial folklore. No one dared laugh publicly, of course, but behind closed doors, the image of the King of England, red-faced and racketless, lived on. Henry's love of sport never truly faded, but his capacity for fun did. As he aged, injured his leg in a later joust, and grew more tyrannical, his athletic pursuits dwindled. The tennis courts fell silent. The hunts became shorter. The energy shifted from play to punishment. But in that one moment, smashing his racket, cursing the air, blaming the ball, he was almost human. Almost. Because even kings, it turns out, hate losing. Next, we meet a monarch whose obsession was a little less violent, but no less intense. A king with stamps, catalogues, and one of the world's most quietly obsessive royal collections. 40. George V and the stamp obsession. George V was the kind of king who preferred adhesives to accolades. In a world where monarchs were expected to ride horses, inspect troops, and give rousing speeches from grand balconies, George's true passion was much quieter. It involved tweezers, magnifying glasses, and climate-controlled albums. Because George V, Emperor of India, King of Great Britain, Defender of the Faith, was also a full-blown philatelist. That is, a stamp collector, not a casual one, not the sort who buys commemorative editions at the post office and calls it a day. George was serious. His personal stamp collection became the Royal Philatelic Collection, today one of the most valuable and comprehensive in the world. And it started with the king himself, kneeling over a table in Buckingham Palace, delicately arranging tiny portraits of Queen Victoria. He was introduced to stamps in childhood by his uncle, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. And while most royal hobbies fade with adolescence, George's only deepened. When he became king, he didn't abandon the pastime. He weaponized it. He hired professional curators. He spent enormous amounts of money on rare specimens. He once outbid every major European collector for a single stamp, the Mauritius post office issue, paying the equivalent of a small estate for a piece of paper smaller than a matchbox. To George, each stamp was a political artifact, a microcosm of empire. His albums didn't just include British stamps, they documented every colonial issue, every distant dominion, every corner of the globe touched by British governance. Stamp collecting for him was part hobby, part historical curation, part imperial inventory. Some monarchs saw the empire through maps. George saw it through postage. Even in moments of personal grief or national crisis, he would return to the comfort of his collection. The noise of war, abdication dramas, and court politics faded the moment he stepped into his quiet stamp room. Tweezers in hand, crown metaphorically off. He didn't just collect, he catalogued, labelled, annotated. The collection wasn't hidden in dusty drawers. It was preserved like scripture. Today, it includes over 300 albums, each filled with stamps placed by the king himself. Ironically, he wasn't the most glamorous monarch. Shy, formal, stiff in public, but his stamps, they glowed with life. Tropical islands, royal anniversaries, great battles, absurd designs. His real personality, it seems, was printed in ink and perforated edges. And if George V ruled with stamps, another king, quite unlike him, ruled by ignoring rule entirely. A man whose romantic preferences scandalized the kingdom, and whose private life became England's most public secret. You're absolutely right. Thank you for catching that. We're resuming in strict accordance with the correct list order. Here's the continuation, starting exactly where we left off. 41. Edward II preferred the company of his male favourites over his Queen Isabella, which scandalised England. Most kings have affairs. Some keep mistresses in secret wings of palaces. Others write dramatic love letters that end up in museums. Edward II, however, managed to scandalise medieval England not just by loving unwisely, but by doing it very publicly, and with men. When Edward married Isabella of France, she was just 12, and a princess of one of Europe's most powerful kingdoms. The union was meant to bring peace, create heirs, and stabilize a crown wobbling after years of war and internal squabbling. In theory, it made sense. In practice, it was a disaster. From the very beginning, it was clear that Isabella had competition, and not from other queens or court ladies. The real threat came from a man named Piers Gaveston, Edward's childhood companion, closest advisor, and, according to half the royal court, romantic partner. Edward didn't try to hide it. He lavished Gaveston with lands, jewels, and titles. He appointed him to key political positions, even when Gaveston lacked any qualifications other than being good at flattery and excellent at being near the king. At Edward and Isabella's coronation, the Queen's ceremonial jewels were allegedly handed to Gaveston. He wore finer robes than most nobles. At feasts, he sat closer to the king than she did. Even in a world that looked the other way for most royal indiscretions, this was too much. English barons, already sick of favoritism and power games, began to see Gaveston not as a royal companion, but as a usurper in velvet. Isabella, meanwhile, was no fool. She bided her time, played the loyal wife, took note of names, and quietly watched as Edward's rule grew weaker under Gaveston's influence. Eventually, the nobles acted. Gaveston was exiled, then brought back, then exiled again, then executed without trial by a faction of enraged lords in 1312. Edward was devastated, but he didn't learn, because soon after, another favourite appeared, Hugh Despenser the Younger. If Gaveston had been flamboyant, Despenser was ruthless. His ambition knew no bounds, and Edward gave him everything he asked for: land, money, legal immunity, power. Again, Isabella was sidelined, this time with less patience. By 1325, she had had enough. She left England under the guise of diplomacy and returned with an army. Alongside her new ally and alleged lover, Roger Mortimer, Isabella invaded. Edward fled. Despenser was captured, tried, and executed in gruesome public fashion. Edward himself was deposed by Parliament, the first English king to be forcibly removed by his own people. His story ends not just in tragedy, but in mystery, with his final years shrouded in isolation, political myth, and rumours of bizarre murder. But his life remains one of the clearest examples in royal history of a king who placed personal devotion above politics and paid for it with his crown. And if you think that scandal rocked England, wait until you hear how Henry VIII responded when a new bride didn't quite live up to her portrait. 42, Henry VIII sent Anne of Cleves away because he said she looked like a Flanders mare. Royal matchmaking has never been subtle, but Henry VIII's fourth marriage might be the pettiest union in English history. The year was 1539, and Henry was once again on the hunt for a bride, politically, not romantically. He needed an alliance, specifically with a Protestant house on the continent, to counteract the Catholic powers breathing down England's neck. Enter Anne of Cleves, a German noblewoman whose family connections made her an ideal candidate. But there was a problem: Henry had never seen her. To solve this, he sent Hans Holbein, the Tudor court's go-to portraitist, to paint her likeness. Holbein, either too diplomatic or too clever, painted Anne in a flattering light: soft features, demure expression, regal posture. The portrait returned to England. Henry saw it and declared her beautiful. Sight unseen, he agreed to the marriage. Then Anne arrived. The meeting, staged as a romantic surprise, went badly. Henry rushed to greet her in disguise, a classic Renaissance love move, expecting her to recognize him by instinct and fall into his arms. Anne, having no clue who this strange man was, barely acknowledged him. Henry took it personally, very personally. He complained that she looked nothing like her portrait, called her dull, uncharming, and most famously muttered that she resembled a Flanders mare. Not exactly poetry. The marriage went ahead for political reasons, but was never consummated. Just months later, Henry sought an annulment, citing her inability to please him, both in appearance and in personality. Anne wisely didn't protest. She accepted the annulment, was granted a generous settlement, and remained in England in comfort, technically as the king's beloved sister. In the end, she outlived all of Henry's wives. The one he rejected turned out to be the luckiest. But while Anne escaped with dignity, another queen knew how to wield flirtation like a weapon, even into her 60s. 43. Elizabeth I flirted shamelessly with younger men at court. Even in her 60s, Elizabeth I never married. She claimed to be wedded to England itself, a virgin queen, untouchable, devoted only to duty. But that didn't stop her from thoroughly enjoying the attention of attractive men. Even in her 60s, with her reign decades deep and her crown more secure than ever, Elizabeth maintained a court full of handsome younger men, and she knew exactly how to keep them circling, with charm, wit, and a healthy dose of courtly flirtation. This wasn't frivolous behaviour, it was politics. Elizabeth understood that her image was her greatest weapon. By maintaining an air of romantic availability, she kept foreign monarchs guessing, rivals at bay, and courtiers dancing to her tune. A potential marriage was always just over the horizon, until it wasn't. Her inner circle included favourites like Robert Dudley, the Earl of Leicester, whose intimate friendship with the Queen sparked decades of speculation. Though they never married, their bond was undeniable, emotionally intense, politically powerful, and deeply envied. Later, the Queen grew close to Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, Dudley's stepson, more than 30 years her junior. He was bold, headstrong, and sometimes reckless. Elizabeth adored him when she wasn't threatening to banish or execute him. To some at court, her flirtations seemed undignified. But Elizabeth didn't care. She cultivated loyalty through affection. She kept her power centralized, not through brute force, but through attention. Even in old age, she maintained her image with painstaking control. Painted white face, fiery red wigs, gowns sewn with pearls. She created the illusion of eternal youth, and when young men bowed to her, complimented her, adored her, she gave just enough back to keep the game going. She was the queen of flirtation, and no one played it better. But not all monarchs kept their romances subtle. Some, like Charles II, were an open book, one filled with footnotes, scandals, and enough illegitimate children to populate a minor city. 44. Charles II openly acknowledged at least a dozen illegitimate children. Charles II was many things: charming, extravagant, politically slippery, but above all, he was honest about his vices. Unlike monarchs who kept mistresses in shadowy corridors and disowned their offspring, Charles was refreshingly transparent. He acknowledged at least a dozen illegitimate children during his reign, likely more, and he didn't just recognize them. He gave them titles, lands, and roles at court. His mistresses, too, weren't hidden. They were celebrities. Barbara Villiers, Nell Gwynn, Louise de Querouaille each held a semi-official role as royal companion, and each bore him children. Their influence was real, at times more real than Parliament's. Charles never tried to present himself as morally rigid. After the austere years of Cromwell's rule, he leaned fully into restoration, of the arts, of entertainment, of indulgence. He brought back theatres, re-legalized Christmas, and filled his court with music and mischief. His many affairs were part of the package. He joked about it. "I am the father of my people," he once quipped, and quite a few others besides. But beneath the wit was strategy. By acknowledging his children, Charles secured alliances and placed loyal bloodlines in key positions. Several of his sons became dukes and courtiers. Their loyalty was baked in, and with no legitimate heirs from his marriage to Queen Catherine of Braganza, Charles used his extended family like political ballast. It wasn't respectable, but it worked, and in contrast to his own father, who lost his head after a disastrous civil war, Charles managed to maintain peace, not through fear, but through charm. A scandalous charm, but effective nonetheless. The next royal, however, wasn't content with charm. He needed something sturdier to support his indulgences, especially in Paris, where comfort had to be custom-built. 45. Edward VII had a custom-built love chair in Paris. Edward VII, even before he became king, was known across Europe for two things: his appetite for food and his appetite for affection. Both required a bit of furniture innovation. During his younger years as Prince of Wales, Edward became a regular visitor to the upscale establishments of Paris, specifically the famous Le Chabanais, one of the city's most exclusive maisons de plaisir. While other royals tried to keep a low profile, Edward embraced his hedonism with trademark flair, so much so that he commissioned a custom love chair, not just a metaphor, but an actual handcrafted contraption designed to accommodate his rather generous physique during his many romantic encounters. The chair was built with reinforced supports, curved platforms, and padded sections, all designed to reduce effort, maximize comfort, and, as the Parisian craftsman delicately put it, assist in royal endeavors. The thing looked part Ottoman, part operating table, and entirely excessive, but to Edward it was practical. He was not a slim man. He enjoyed 7-course meals, cigars, port, and second helpings of everything. Physical activity of any kind required engineering. So the chair. Its legend spread quickly. Guests whispered about it. Artists drew parodies. Paris giggled, London blushed, and Edward predictably didn't care. He had long since stopped pretending to be restrained. His mother, Queen Victoria, was perpetually horrified by his habits, but Edward revelled in the persona of the rogue prince, a man who broke etiquette, defied expectations, and required custom upholstery to enjoy his evenings. Ironically, when he finally became king, he proved surprisingly competent, diplomatic, tactful, prepared, but in Paris he would always be remembered not as a statesman, but as the man with the chair. And while Edward's chair was famous in France, the next king's most scandalous act happened in secret, a marriage so forbidden it had to be erased. 46. George IV secretly married a Catholic widow, then pretended it never happened. Before he became king, George IV was already famous for his excess. Excessive debts, excessive dinners, and excessive drama. So naturally, when it came time for romance, he didn't settle for scandal light. He secretly married a Catholic widow named Maria Fitzherbert, a woman older than him, smarter than him, and definitely more dignified. There was just one problem: the marriage was completely illegal. Under the Royal Marriages Act of 1772, any royal descendant had to get the monarch's permission to wed. And under English law at the time, marrying a Catholic not only disqualified you from the line of succession, it was politically radioactive. George had neither permission nor tact, but he did have passion and, more importantly, drama. He proposed to Maria after threatening to throw himself into emotional ruin if she refused. She initially declined, knowing the political consequences, but eventually gave in. They were married in a private ceremony in 1785. No palace, no procession, no parliament. The relationship, while sincere in parts, was also desperately inconvenient. When George's mounting debts needed state assistance, Parliament made one thing clear: no funds unless the illegal marriage disappeared. And just like that, George erased it from the record. Maria was sidelined, demoted from secret wife to uncomfortable footnote. George would go on to marry Caroline of Brunswick in a legally sanctioned, mutually miserable union. He never stopped corresponding with Maria, though, and when he died, he reportedly requested to be buried with a miniature portrait of her. Romantic? Perhaps. Reckless? Definitely. But George wasn't the only royal whose affections raised eyebrows. His father, Henry VIII, once found himself torn between two women who just so happened to be mother and daughter. Naturally, he tried to marry both. 47. Henry VIII once proposed marriage to both mother and daughter from the same noble family. Even by Tudor standards, a dynasty known for impulsive weddings and unfortunate endings, this one was bold. At some point in the marital chaos that defined Henry VIII's reign, he reportedly became enamored with a noblewoman from the Howard family. This in itself wasn't unusual. The Howards were one of England's most prominent families, and several of their daughters graced the royal court. What was unusual was that Henry also had his eye on her daughter. Which one came first? It depends on which chronicle you trust. But whether it was mother then daughter or daughter then mother, one fact was consistent. Henry allegedly considered both women as potential wives, not in sequence, concurrently. The implications were enormous, legally, morally, diplomatically. Marrying a mother and her daughter wasn't just awkward, it was considered a form of incest under church law. Even after Henry's break from Rome, such rules still held symbolic power. The idea that the King of England could consider flipping between generations like he was choosing dinner courses didn't sit well with the clergy, or anyone else for that matter. Eventually, he chose neither. Whether out of religious pressure or personal whim, he backed off. But the damage was done. The court buzzed. Ambassadors sent scandalized reports home. And the Howards, already deep in the political game, learned that royal attention was as dangerous as it was prestigious. It's unclear how the women involved felt about the proposals. Like most Tudor women, their opinions were recorded sparsely, if at all, but one can assume that dinner conversation in that household got awkward fast. And while Henry played matchmaker with family trees, James I took a different route. He built a court, not of brides, but of favourites, handsome ones, with nicknames. 48. James I filled his court with handsome young men, nicknamed his favourites. Sparking gossip, James I, first of the Stuart kings of England, brought with him a refreshingly unfiltered approach to monarchy and a very specific aesthetic. He liked young men, not just as courtiers or advisers, but as favourites. Public, pampered, and suspiciously well-dressed favourites. His court quickly filled with these men, many of whom were described as strikingly attractive, artistically inclined, and exceptionally close to the king. Some historians stop short of speculating too much. Others don't hesitate. The king's letters to his favourites were filled with florid praise, emotional longing, and affectionate nicknames. His relationship with George Villiers, Duke of Buckingham, was especially famous. James once wrote to him, "I desire only to live in the world for your sake." It didn't help the optics that Villiers rose to power incredibly fast, going from nobody to duke in what felt like a political heartbeat, or that his influence over the king became so absolute that ministers began bypassing James entirely, seeking Villiers' approval instead. James's earlier favourite, Robert Carr, followed a similar path, plucked from obscurity, lavished with titles, and ultimately disgraced after being implicated in a messy murder scandal. But even then, James remained protective. The king insisted these relationships were chaste. Court gossip begged to differ. Satirical pamphlets, foreign ambassadors, and even some nobles whispered that the king's affections blurred too many lines, not just personal, but political. Favoritism turned the court into a high-stakes beauty contest, where merit took a back seat to charisma. But James didn't care. He ruled with sentiment, not spin. And while England adjusted to this new form of royal intimacy, one queen decided to do the opposite. Not embrace her son's desires, but try to smother them entirely. 49. Queen Victoria disapproved of her son Edward VII's love of parties. If ever a royal mother disapproved of her son's hobbies, it was Queen Victoria and Edward VII. She ruled in mourning black. He ruled in everything else. Victoria spent most of her long widowhood scolding Edward, known as Bertie, for his obsession with the pleasures of life. Fine food, lavish parties, glamorous actresses, extravagant travel. If it sparkled or smoked, Bertie was probably there, and she hated it. She viewed her eldest son as a national embarrassment. In her mind, he was unserious, unreliable, and dangerously inclined toward vice. "You are never to be trusted," she once wrote to him, a blunt summary of decades of disappointment. To be fair, Bertie gave her plenty of material. He was a magnet for gossip. His affairs were legendary, his weight was a matter of political concern, and his time as Prince of Wales was seen more as a long-running cabaret act than a royal apprenticeship. But he also never got a chance to prove otherwise. Victoria kept him away from state matters for decades. She denied him responsibilities, shunned him from political briefings. To her, grief was power, and Bertie, with his cigars and champagne, disrupted that power. The irony, of course, was that when he finally became Edward VII in 1901, he ruled quite competently. He repaired strained foreign relations, charmed the public, and navigated a monarchy that had grown stale under the shadow of endless mourning. But while he reigned in confidence, he'd never truly shaken his mother's disapproval. Even from beyond the grave, Victoria's ghost lingered like a judgmental footman. Still, Bertie managed to outlive the critique, and even left behind a few royal relics more lasting than tabloid rumours. Which brings us to one of the stranger facts of monarchy, a royal marriage contract involving a 6-year-old bride. 50. Richard II married Isabella of Valois when she was only 6 years old. If the idea of royal marriages as political transactions feels uncomfortable today, Richard II's union with Isabella of Valois takes discomfort to an entirely new historical level. She was 6, he was 29. Let's pause there. This wasn't a love match. It was a diplomatic performance, choreographed with the urgency of European politics. England and France had been locked in the 100 Years' War, a conflict that was less about 100 years and more about egos stretched across generations. A marriage between the English king and a French princess was seen as a necessary balm, and so, in 1396, Richard married Isabella, daughter of Charles VI of France. There was no scandal, at least not at the time. In fact, the marriage was hailed as a diplomatic triumph. Richard promised not to consummate the union until Isabella was older. She would be treated with honour, raised in England as a future queen, and serve as a symbol of peace. Still, the image of a child bride walking through Westminster, flanked by royal guards and flower-strewn processions, is haunting. The court made polite speeches. Chronicles noted her grace, but behind the pageantry was the unmistakable reality of how young she was, holding a doll in one hand and a king's future in the other. Of course, peace didn't last. Richard was deposed just 4 years later by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, who became Henry IV. Isabella, now 10, was left stranded in a foreign kingdom, her symbolic marriage unravelling in real time. Eventually, she was returned to France and married again, this time to someone closer to her own age. As for Richard, his reign ended not with a dynasty, but with a mystery. And speaking of endings, not all royal deaths were equal. Some were quiet, some were suspicious, some were so bizarre they've haunted history ever since. 51. Edward II was reportedly murdered in a bizarre and brutal way. Few monarchs have had their reputations rewritten more than Edward II, and that includes the way he died. After being deposed by his wife Isabella and her ally Roger Mortimer, Edward was imprisoned in a damp, remote castle. The new regime had no interest in him returning to the throne, or frankly in him surviving, but they also didn't want a public execution. A deposed king's blood on your hands was never a good look, so he simply disappeared, or so the official records would like you to think. The real story, the one repeated with hushed voices and suspicious glances for centuries, is that Edward met a grotesque end, a death that was deliberately humiliating, theatrical, and impossible to prove. Medieval chroniclers claimed it involved a method meant to leave no visible marks, allowing the body to be displayed without evidence of foul play. But even in the Middle Ages, people understood theatre. This version of events, as lurid as it was unconfirmed, spread quickly. It served a purpose: to shock, to warn, to legitimize a new ruler through sheer horror. Modern historians are more skeptical. Some believe Edward may have actually escaped, living out his days in exile under an alias. Others suspect he was quietly murdered, buried without fanfare, and that the rest is pure myth-making. But the rumor never died. It's the kind of death that invites conspiracy. Too strange to ignore, too unprovable to confirm. The perfect end for a monarch who defied conventions in life and in death became a cautionary tale. And as eerie as Edward's death may be, it pales in comparison to the king who died under mysterious circumstances in the woods, struck by an arrow that may not have been meant for hunting at all. 52. William II, Rufus, died mysteriously when an arrow struck him while hunting. Of all the ways for a king to go, William II, also known as William Rufus, chose, or perhaps didn't choose, one of the most mysterious. It was a hunting trip in the New Forest in 1100, a royal pastime, nothing unusual. William rode out with a small group of nobles, including Walter Tyrrell, a trusted courtier and skilled archer. The weather was fine, spirits were high. Then came the arrow. According to accounts, Tyrrell loosed a shot aimed at a deer. Instead, it struck the king in the chest. William fell, and within minutes he was dead. Sounds accidental, right? At least, that's what the official story claimed. But the details didn't sit right, even at the time. Tyrrell fled immediately, not just the forest, but the country. He never returned. The other nobles scattered. William's body was left unattended, lying in the woods like any commoner, until a group of peasants carted him back to Winchester. No grand procession, no royal honours, just an unceremonious burial and a lot of awkward silence. Historians have speculated ever since. Was it an accident? Perhaps. But William wasn't exactly beloved. He was known for heavy taxation, conflicts with the church, and a suspiciously long list of enemies. And let's not forget who benefited most from his death: Henry, his younger brother. Within hours of William's demise, Henry raced to secure the treasury, seized the royal crown, and had himself proclaimed king before the blood had dried. Coincidence? Possibly, but even 1,000 years later, the scene remains suspicious. A king killed in the woods, a missing archer, a conveniently positioned heir. It reads less like history and more like the opening of a medieval thriller. And as for bizarre royal deaths, the next one wasn't a mystery. It was just deeply unfortunate and embarrassingly explosive. 53. Henry VIII's body was said to have exploded in his coffin. After a lifetime of feasting, fighting, and politically motivated marriages, Henry VIII exited the world in a manner somehow as dramatic as his reign. His body reportedly exploded in its coffin. He died in 1547 at the age of 55, after years of deteriorating health, plagued by infections, obesity, and mood swings so famous they've become shorthand for bad leadership. But even in death, Henry refused to go quietly. The story goes that as his body lay in state in St. George's Chapel at Windsor, royal officials delayed the burial due to funeral arrangements and the elaborate rituals expected for a monarch of his stature. Unfortunately, the embalming, let's say, didn't hold up to Tudor standards. According to one account, Henry's bloated corpse began to leak and rupture inside the sealed coffin. The smell became overwhelming. So did the symbolism. A servant reportedly remarked that the dogs have licked his blood, echoing a biblical curse once directed at wicked kings. Historians debate how much of this is factual and how much is Reformation-era propaganda. After all, Henry had made more than a few enemies by splitting from the Catholic Church, dissolving monasteries, and executing anyone who dared disagree. But the story persisted, and like most great royal legends, its staying power matters more than its proof. In the end, Henry VIII's final moment became a dark punchline, a king who consumed too much land, power, people, and whose own body rebelled against him in death. A fitting end, perhaps, for a man who left behind a kingdom changed forever, 6 wives with varying fates, and a reputation so large it couldn't quite be contained, even in a coffin. And with that, our bizarre journey through English royalty closes appropriately on a bang.